For 12 days, Eliza Sullivan was dead. There was a funeral, a casket, a eulogy. Her husband stood beside her photograph and cried in front of 40 people. He cried beautifully, convincingly, the way only someone who had practiced could. And that same night, in a penthouse apartment she never knew existed, he opened a bottle of champagne with her sister and said, "To freedom, to $135 million, to us." He had no idea that the FBI was listening to every word. No idea that the body bag his hired man carried out of the estate was filled with 80 pounds of sand. No idea that Eliza was alive, 60 miles away in a safe house, watching his funeral for her on a laptop, because she had given him the rope. And she waited while he tied the knot himself. What she did to make sure he never saw daylight again is the kind of story that reminds you, the most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest one. It's the one who already knows everything and says nothing. Survival is not just about escaping. It's about coming back stronger, wiser, and prepared to win. Comment below. Are you ready to hear the rest? Like this video, share it with someone who loves a story where justice actually wins, and subscribe so you never miss what we bring you next. This content was manually researched, developed, and carefully edited by our team to deliver meaning and a lasting lesson.
In my years as a counselor, I've learned that some people wear masks so perfectly you'd swear they were born with them. I worked with a man, we'll call him Brandon, who was a master. Watching him guide his wife, Stephanie, through the haze of her own mother's funeral was, in a dark way, a work of art. 3 days later, in the hushed tones of a lawyer's office, the abstract grief turned into concrete numbers. A $47 million inheritance, properties, even a vineyard. For him, this was the end game. Later, in the echoing silence of their home, he made a call, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, never imagining the person on the other end was tied by blood to the woman he was destroying. A mutual friend later described the chilling note of victory in Brandon's voice that day. "The old woman is finally out of the picture," he'd said. "It's all Stephanie's now," which means it's about to be ours. He had no idea Stephanie was standing just out of sight, feeling the entire architecture of her life get bulldozed by his words. In that one devastating moment, a new resolve hardened inside her. She wasn't just going to leave him. She was going to systematically take apart everything he thought he had won. It's a profound and terrifying strength that can be forged in the fire of absolute betrayal. It's the kind of story that feels like it belongs on a screen, the kind of psychological horror that can unmake a person. I've changed the names to protect the family, but the emotional truth of it is something I carry with me. It all began to unravel in a small chapel in St. Helena, the air thick with lilies and loss. Brandon, as he later recounted to me in our sessions, was playing the role of the perfectly bereaved son-in-law, and he was giving the performance of a lifetime. Stephanie's hands were bone white in her lap, her eyes locked on the polished casket overflowing with white roses, her mother's favorite. Catherine Miller had been a force of nature, taken at 70 by a brutal stage 4 pancreatic cancer that gave her less than 3 months. As the priest offered words of comfort, Brandon admitted to me that his mind wasn't on heaven or loss. He was mentally counting down the minutes until his real life, the one he had orchestrated, could finally start. What Brandon never understood, what a man like him is incapable of understanding, is the kind of strength a person builds when they've already survived the unthinkable. Stephanie's heart wasn't just broken, it had been shattered before. It was only 8 months prior that I had learned of her first husband, Eric, being lowered into the ground. He'd been killed instantly in a horrific head-on collision, not 10 minutes from their home. A sudden, senseless tragedy. Now, her mother. 2 funerals in less than 1 year. At just 34, Stephanie had worn that same simple black dress more than any soul should have to. And through it all, there was Brandon, her second husband, his hand a constant, reassuring weight on hers. They'd only been married for 10 months, a swift courthouse ceremony after he swooped in as the man who was helping her pick up the pieces. He was a financial advisor, he'd told her. Tall, strikingly handsome, with a disarming smile that seemed too good to be true. And Stephanie, in the depths of her grief, had needed to believe in that smile. "You're holding up so well," he murmured to her in the pew, his voice a steady anchor in the emotional storm. "It's almost over." She could only nod, feeling wrapped in cotton. The reception was to be at the family's Napa Valley estate. 142 acres of rolling vineyards, with a sprawling home that Brandon saw as the ultimate trophy in his cold, patient conquest. Catherine Miller had built that vineyard from nothing into an empire, a name in the industry that pulled in $25 million a year. In Brandon's mind, his name was already on the deed. The grand living room was a sea of dark suits and hushed voices, business partners, old friends, distant cousins, all offering the same well-meaning but empty condolences. I picture Stephanie moving through that room like a ghost, her face a perfect, fragile mask of composure, accepting sympathies that barely registered. Across the room, her younger sister, Jessica, leaned against a marble fireplace, holding a glass of Chardonnay as if it were a life raft. She looked like she could shatter at any moment, her eyes darting around nervously, a hunted look about her. Jessica's struggle with a cocaine addiction was a painful, open secret. After 2 costly and unsuccessful stays in rehab, her mother had tried everything, from cutting off her allowance to desperate ultimatums. But the addiction had its claws in deep. Jessica's eyes met Stephanie's across the room, and she lifted her glass in a slow, almost defiant gesture. The look she gave back wasn't one of shared grief. It felt cold, transactional, and it sent a chill down Stephanie's spine. By 6, the last of the guests had drifted away, leaving the house in that heavy, deep silence that only follows a funeral. When Stephanie went upstairs to change, she found Brandon in the kitchen, pouring a large scotch, his tie already loosened. The show was over. "You doing okay?" he asked, pushing a glass toward her across the cool marble island. It was a perfect imitation of a caring husband. She just shook her head, muttering that she felt like she could sleep for a week. "I know," he said, kissing her gently on the forehead. "Go on up. I'll handle things down here." It was the perfect excuse to get her out of the way. As a bone-tired Stephanie started up the grand staircase, she heard the buzz of Brandon's phone. She stopped on the landing, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles ached. His voice floated up from the kitchen, but it was different now. All the warmth, the practiced sympathy, was gone. "Yeah, it's done. She's finally gone." Stephanie later told me she felt frozen to that step. The old lady left Stephanie everything. $135 million. Once I get control of the accounts, we're set. Her heart started hammering against her ribs as she crept silently back down, skipping the one stair that always creaked. The glass in her hand started to shake. "No, she has no idea," Brandon laughed. A sound that had once felt so charming now sounded utterly grotesque. "She's upstairs right now, probably crying her eyes out. Just give me 2 weeks. The moment that estate is in my name, we are gone. I'm thinking Bali or the Maldives, somewhere they can never find us. With her back pressed against the cold wall of the hallway, Stephanie fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she opened the voice recorder. Her thumb hit the red button, a silent, desperate prayer. Jessica's on board, Brandon continued, and that was the line that twisted the knife. She's in deep. How's some dealer 100 grand? She'll do whatever I say. Her own sister. The betrayal felt bottomless. All right, I'll call you tomorrow, he said, lowering his voice to end the call. Just keep your head down until it's finished. The line went dead. Stephanie looked at her phone's screen. The recording was 3 minutes and 42 seconds long. It was the only proof she had, but it was everything. She slipped out a side door into the garden, the cool night air smelling of rosemary and damp earth. As the sun set over the vineyards, staining the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, she saw them. Brandon and Jessica were by a stone fountain at the edge of the lawn, standing closer than a brother and sister-in-law should. Jessica's hand was on his arm. Brandon leaned in and whispered something. Jessica laughed, not her usual nervous titter, but a full, genuine laugh that turned Stephanie's blood to ice. Stephanie ducked behind a hedge, moving closer. 2 more weeks, Brandon was saying, his voice calm and certain. That's when we file the transfer. Jessica's reply was thin with anxiety. What if she gets suspicious? He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. She won't. She's too buried in her grief to see anything clearly. Trust me. Jessica just nodded, biting her thumbnail. I need this to be done, Jessica said, her voice cracking with desperation. Marco is threatening me. If he doesn't get his money soon... Brandon cut her off, his tone soothing. You'll get the money. Once Stephanie signs everything over, you'll have more than you need to vanish and start over. That's what you wanted, right? He leaned in and kissed her forehead. The exact same empty gesture he'd given Stephanie an hour before. And then walked back to the house. Jessica stayed by the fountain, hugging herself, just a fragile pawn in a cruel game she didn't even understand. Stephanie remained hidden in the dark until her sister finally went inside, her phone having captured every last word. The sky had faded to a deep, dark purple. Her mother was dead, and now her husband and sister were actively plotting to take everything that was left. She realized, with a clarity that cut through the grief, that this was never just about the money. Looking at the 2 recordings on her phone, her first raw instinct was to run inside and confront them, to watch their lies fall apart. But she knew Brandon. He was a master of denial, a weaver of twisted narratives. He would turn it all around until she was the one who seemed crazy. She knew a direct fight was a losing battle. She had to see the full picture first, understand the shape of the betrayal. I can only imagine what was going through her mind as she smoothed her sweater and walked back inside. A new, chilling certainty settling deep in her bones. When I worked with Brandon, he remembered that moment with such clarity. He was just sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone. He told me he smiled when he saw her. Hey, I thought you turned in for the night. And her voice, he said, was a perfect imitation of normal when she answered. Just needed a minute outside. I'm heading up now. Want me to come with you? He'd offered. A simple, loving gesture. No, she'd said, her voice so soft he didn't detect the steel beneath it. I think I need to be by myself tonight. He just accepted it, got up, and gave her a kiss on the cheek. I love you, he said. And somehow she found the strength to echo it back. I love you too. He described to me how he heard her walk up the stairs to their room, the click of the lock. He had no idea she was sitting in the dark, pressing play on the recordings that would end their life, listening again and again and again. The tragic irony, as Brandon pieces it together now, is almost unbearable. He was operating in a totally separate reality, one where he was the good guy, the protector. He was trying to manage her volatile sister, Jessica, telling her things like, once we get you into that program, everything will be fine. Stephanie is on your side. We just have to get through this. Meanwhile, Stephanie was just rooms away, silently assembling her arsenal, her search history a quiet declaration of war. He never knew was happening. He thought they were a team against the world. She was already planning a battle against him. He painted the scene in the lawyer's office for me just 3 days after the funeral. He said the place smelled like old leather and polish, the kind of scent that clings to generational wealth. He and Stephanie sat across a huge mahogany desk that felt more like a barrier than a piece of furniture. Brandon recalled how the light from the blinds sliced the room into dark stripes, like the bars of a cage. Their attorney, a quiet, older man named Mr. Peterson, looked at them over his glasses. The atmosphere in Mr. Peterson's wood-paneled office was suffocating. He was Eleanor's lawyer, the family's trusted advisor, the person you were supposed to be able to count on. Brandon sat next to his wife, Stephanie, and put his hand on her knee, trying to be a steadying presence in what he knew was a storm. He wouldn't learn until much later that she said his touch felt like a spider crawling on her. On Stephanie's other side, her sister Jessica was a bundle of raw nerves, her foot tapping a frantic beat on the floor, looking even more wrecked than she had at the service. Brandon described her appearance with a painful wince. The shadows under Jessica's eyes weren't just smudges, they were deep, bruised hollows. A fine layer of sweat glistened on her forehead, the telltale sign of withdrawal. She was only 72 hours into a shaky new sobriety, and her body was screaming in protest. From behind the fortress of his desk, Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. He placed his hands on a thick stack of documents, the gatekeeper of their fate. When he spoke, his voice was a low, even drone. Thank you for coming in. I realize this is a profoundly difficult moment, the lawyer began, his tone perfectly calibrated for grief, completely oblivious to the ruin he was about to cause. Eleanor entrusted me with her estate, and I plan to follow her wishes to the letter. This is just a preliminary overview. She wanted her family to have clarity without delay. He opened the top folder with a crisp rustle of paper, and with that ordinary sound, Brandon's entire world started to fracture. It began, as these stories so often do, with the reading of a will. This one belonged to Eleanor Morgan, signed last June, not even 2 months before she died. She'd known her time was short. Brandon said he could feel the air in the room tighten as the lawyer started to speak. The first item was for his wife, Stephanie. She was named the sole beneficiary of the Morgan Family Trust, $47 million, held in a protected fund created back in 2012. The legal jargon was mostly noise to Brandon, but the final sum was clear. The money was hers alone, shielded from any legal challenges, and transferred directly to Stephanie. He told me he gave her knee a little squeeze, a reflex of support, a gesture she gave no sign of noticing. Mr. Peterson's voice carried on. A massive estate in Napa Valley valued at $28 million, a $12 million oceanfront property in Carmel, Commercial buildings in San Francisco worth another 15 million. Across from them, Jessica looked like she was about to fall apart. Brandon heard her suck in a sharp, unsteady breath. Then, the next blow landed. The lawyer stated that Stephanie would also assume complete control of Morgan Vineyards LLC, a business that brought in about $25 million a year. He let that figure hang in the heavy silence before finally addressing Jessica. Her inheritance was $500,000, but it came with a brutal catch. It was locked in a trust she couldn't touch until she finished a certified rehab program and stayed clean for a solid year. The silence after that, Brandon said, was absolute, and then Jessica's voice cut right through it. That's it? Her words were thin and sharp. She flew out of her seat, the chair legs screaming against the polished floor. 500 grand? She pointed a shaking finger at Stephanie, and she gets it all. With unshakable calm, Mr. Peterson explained that their mother had left a letter detailing Jessica's struggles with addiction, her two previous relapses, and what Eleanor had described as a history of severe financial irresponsibility. This, their mother had written, was the only way to be responsible with the family's assets. Responsible? Jessica's voice was a raw, strangled cry. Her hands were trembling. She wrote me off. My own mother cut me off. Stephanie began to murmur her sister's name, a gentle plea. But Jessica turned on her, her eyes flashing with a trapped, desperate anger. Don't, she hissed. Don't you even pretend you care. You got exactly what you always wanted: the property, the money, the precious family name. She loaded those last words with a poison that seemed to drop the temperature in the room. That's when Brandon stood up, falling into his usual role, the peacemaker, the steady hand. He put a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "Jessica, come on, let's sit down," he said softly. "This isn't the time or place." She shoved his hand away like it was on fire. "Get away from me." Mr. Peterson also rose, his professional demeanor a solid wall. "Miss Morgan, I understand this is upsetting, but your mother did this out of love. The trust is structured to support you as soon as you are healthy. That was her deepest wish," the lawyer concluded. Jessica let out a laugh, a hollow, bitter sound with no joy in it. "Her wish," she sneered. "Yeah, right." She grabbed her bag from the carpet and headed for the door. "I'm out of this and of all of you." The door slammed shut, the sound hanging in the air. For a moment, nobody said a thing. Finally, Brandon, always playing the part of the good husband, turned to Stephanie. "I should probably go make sure she's all right," he said, his face etched with real worry. Stephanie replied quietly that Jessica just needed space, but Brandon couldn't shake his concern. "I know, but even so..." He bent down to kiss her forehead. "I won't be long." After he left, a tense quiet settled between Stephanie and the lawyer. It stretched on before Mr. Peterson finally took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, letting out a heavy sigh. "And what about you, Stephanie? How are you holding up through all this?" he asked, his voice gentle. Stephanie just gave a small, vague shrug. "I'm okay." The lawyer nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "Your mother loved you more than anything. Every move she made, it was to keep you safe." "I know," she replied. But he leaned in slightly, pushing just a little harder. "Are you sure?" His voice lowered. "Eleanor came to see me 6 months ago. She was already sick by then, though nobody knew just how bad it was. She came in to finalize the will, but that wasn't the only reason." The lawyer paused, picking his words carefully. "She told me she was worried about you." A cold knot of dread as Brandon later learned, began to twist in Stephanie's gut. Worried about what? She didn't give me specifics, Mr. Peterson went on. Just that she had serious concerns about certain people in your life. People she was afraid might not have your best interests at heart. In that instant, Stephanie's mind must have jumped to a phone call she'd partly overheard. A piece of a conversation Brandon was having about some investment. "Once I get my hands on those accounts, we'll be set for life," he'd said, talking about some tech company, but now the words sounded entirely different. "Did she say who it was?" Stephanie asked, her voice strained. He gave a slow shake of his head. "No, but she left something for you. A personal message that she was adamant you see alone." Stephanie's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "Not here, and not today," he said, shooting a meaningful look at the door. "Come back tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp." He met her eyes, his own look serious. "And Stephanie, it's critical that you come by yourself." Right as she was about to argue, the door opened and Brandon reappeared looking relieved. "Jessica's fine," he announced. "She's in the car." His gaze moved between his wife and the lawyer, picking up on the immediate change in the room's atmosphere. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Stephanie said. "Maybe a little too fast." "Mr. Peterson and I were just wrapping up." Brandon managed a strained smile that never touched his eyes. "Okay, let's get going home." He would only find out later that, as the lawyer, Eric, shook Stephanie's hand, his grip was a silent, solid promise of a newly forged alliance. The journey back to their sprawling vineyard home was thick with a silence that felt heavy enough to choke on. Brandon told me he kept stealing glances at Stephanie, trying to decipher her expression, but her gaze was fixed on the world outside the passenger window, lost somewhere he couldn't follow. She was seeing past the familiar, rolling hills of vines, her thoughts wrestling with $47 million, with vast tracts of land, with a whole empire she now had to defend. Meanwhile, the man I came to know, sitting right beside her, was battling a completely different kind of terror. The nauseating certainty that his marriage was silently crumbling for reasons he couldn't comprehend. He had no idea that, in her world, he'd already been judged and sentenced as the enemy, the one who was about to take it all away. The following morning, Stephanie announced she was taking a spa day to unwind. Brandon was relieved, thinking it was just the thing she needed after all the stress. He never for a second questioned it. But she wasn't driving to a spa. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she sped back toward the city, making a direct line for the lawyer's building. Eric was expecting her. He was ready to lay out the very evidence that would cement her paranoid anxieties into what she would accept as cold, hard fact. He shut the massive oak door of his office, and Brandon later fixated on this one detail: the sound of the lock turning, a quiet, decisive click that shut his wife in and him out, forever. Eric motioned for her to sit as he pulled a tablet from a locked cabinet. Its screen was dark. "Your mother instructed me to record this for you 6 months ago," he said, his voice grave. "It was on February 10th, about 2 weeks after she got the final diagnosis. She made me swear it would stay sealed until she passed, and that you, and only you, would ever see it." Stephanie's mouth was dry. "What is it?" he told me she'd asked. Eric looked at her with an expression Brandon could only describe as manufactured pity. She felt she needed to justify her decisions, and she wanted to give you a warning. Then he hit play. The tablet screen came to life. It was her mother, Catherine, sitting in the study of their family home, She looked frail, the illness having already taken its toll. But when Stephanie later described it to Brandon, the only thing she mentioned was her mother's eyes. They were as sharp and resolute as ever. A woman at death's door, using what little strength she had left to turn her own daughter against the man who loved her. As Brandon recounted this part to me, his voice still thick with an ache that felt brand new, he explained the video started with Catherine Morgan staring into the camera, her expression a silent accusation. "Stephanie," she began, and the mere sound of her voice was enough to shatter his wife's composure. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. And for that, my sweet girl, I am endlessly sorry." Stephanie was sobbing by then, tears carving tracks down her cheeks. "You need to listen to me very closely," Catherine's image insisted. "You need to know the truth about Brandon." And just like that, he became the villain in his own life story. Catherine's face on the screen was a study in cold determination. She detailed how a standard estate audit some months back had uncovered a pattern of irregularities. She talked about a series of small, consistent digital transfers from Stephanie's private accounts, $5,000 at a time, then 10, that Catherine swore her daughter never approved. Over 2 years, it had grown into an astonishing amount. Brandon insisted to me, with everything he had, that he never touched a dime, that the entire thing was a grotesque, fabricated nightmare. The number that appeared on the screen was obscene. $850,000, the image of her mother announced from the tablet. "He took every cent from you, Stephanie." My friend Brandon told me his wife turned ashen, looking like she might faint. The ghost of Catherine kept spinning her web, a tale of phantom companies and embezzled cash. She had even hired a private investigator, a man named Avery Thorne, to give the entire lie a veneer of truth. The claims grew even more wild. The man she had shared her life with, my friend Brandon Pierce, was a phantom. His real name, they claimed, was Brandon Michael Caldwell, a wanted con artist being pursued by the SEC. A predator who, they alleged, destroyed lives for financial gain and then simply disappeared. And this monster, according to the video, had chosen Stephanie as his next victim. "He targeted you, Stephanie." Catherine's voice on the recording pressed on, cracking with practiced grief. "Right after your father passed away, when you were at your most vulnerable." It was a perfect, diabolical narrative. The grieving heiress and the sophisticated predator. Brandon described how Stephanie clapped a hand over her mouth, trying to keep from being sick. "I wanted so badly to tell you," the recording lied, "but I was just too scared." Scared of what, though? Brandon was the gentlest man I'd ever met. But Catherine's story cast him as a menace, implying she feared for Stephanie's physical safety if she ever revealed the truth. So, she devised this, a posthumous demolition of his character, paired with a new will that locked everything in a trust, safely away from the man she'd turned into a monster. She called it protection. But it was nothing more than her final, desperate act of control. The cancer, it came on too fast, she said on screen, her eyes dropping for a moment before snapping back to the lens, hard as steel. "Eric has it all, the proof, the financial records, the complete investigator's file. But you have to be careful, Stephanie. If Brandon even thinks you know, he will become unpredictable." The message was a clear threat, designed to make Stephanie see her own husband as a danger. And the poison didn't stop there. The video's assault wasn't only on Brandon, it pulled Stephanie's sister into the web. Catherine delivered a devastating blow. A man like that doesn't just walk away from $135 million. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper designed to break her daughter's heart. And, honey, I don't think you can rely on Jessica either. She claimed Jessica and Brandon had been meeting in secret for the last 6 months. She spun a tale of quiet lunches and secret coffee meetings, warping innocent family moments into evidence of a conspiracy. I tried to believe she was just being naive, Catherine said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sorrow. But I fear it's much worse than that. Her final words were a toxic blend of pity and a call to arms. I am so sorry you have to face this alone, but you are strong. You are my daughter. Don't you dare let them ruin your future. Her mother's last words were a command. You can't let them get away with this, she urged, her eyes seeming to burn right through the screen. I love you. Always. And then the screen went dark. Brandon told me Stephanie was just sitting there, completely broken, while Eric the lawyer watched her. Her voice was barely a whisper. Does Brandon know about this video? Eric's answer was a single devastating word. No, Catherine's plan had been executed flawlessly, kept hidden from the entire world. Stephanie, grasping at straws, apparently asked, "But what about the SEC?" Eric calmly recited the lines he had clearly rehearsed. There's not enough there, not for a criminal case. Unwinding these things takes years. Brandon is an expert at covering his tracks. That gives us time. But it means an arrest isn't likely. Every single word was a cage. Brandon said he could picture the whole scene perfectly. His wife, lost in her grief, looking at the lawyer with desperate eyes and whispering, "What am I supposed to do?" Eric then offered her a small flash drive, pressing it into her hand. "It's all here," he told her. The bank statements, account numbers, photos, even stories from other women he supposedly ruined. It isn't enough for the police, but it's for you. She took the drive like it was a sacred relic. Your mother wanted you to be prepared, Eric went on. You have choices. You can call the police. You can file for divorce. You can confront him. Brandon imagined Eric pausing then, his expression serious. Or you can get more. Build a case that is so ironclad that he can't possibly deny it. That figure had to be echoing in her mind. $850,000. A fake marriage, a history of victims. For Stephanie, all the fabricated pieces were now clicking into place, creating a horrifying new reality. Her sister, Jessica, secretly meeting with Brandon, her own mother warning her from the grave. Her voice, Brandon imagined, turned to ice. I want more. Eric, the puppet master, just nodded. Then, we'll get more. As she was leaving, she dropped the flash drive into her purse. Thank you for this, Eric. His response was sickeningly smooth. Your mother loved you more than anything. She just wanted to protect you. Brandon told me Stephanie couldn't even speak. She just nodded once and walked out of that office, her mother's final command ringing in her ears. Don't let them win. And in that moment, she made a silent vow to destroy the man she had married. He, of course, knew nothing. He still thought it was them against the world, but she was already gathering the fuel to set his entire life on fire. In the days that followed, Stephanie changed completely. Brandon said the woman he shared a home with became a different person, anxious and distant. He wouldn't learn until much later that she'd been using untraceable prepaid cards to order surveillance equipment online. While he was at his office, working to build the life they'd planned, she was installing hidden cameras all over their house and had put a private investigator on retainer. And the part that still haunts him? She felt zero guilt, only a chilling sense of empowerment. The spy equipment started showing up in plain brown boxes. Brandon would piece the timeline together afterward, imagining her on their kitchen island, unboxing the tiny camera lenses while he was at the firm, the job he left for every morning at 9 o'clock sharp. For their main living area, she had picked out a camera cleverly disguised as a smoke detector. As a counselor, you hear stories that stay with you. Brandon's was one of them. He told me the first camera he found was in his own office, a tiny lens staring out from what looked like a simple USB charger plugged into the wall. Another was in their wine cellar, tucked inside a hollowed-out book placed right next to a copy of The Art of War. He actually let out a dry, pained laugh when he told me that. They were sophisticated little devices, video only. His wife, Stephanie, was smart enough to avoid the felony of audio recording. She only needed pictures to build her narrative. She was looking for a single damning image, any moment she could twist. He learned later that the cameras fed into a private cloud server she could access from anywhere. He described this picture he had in his head of her, sitting in the guest room, just watching him on her phone. One camera was aimed squarely at their front door. The one in his office was focused on his desk, on his personal papers. And the cellar camera covered everything, including the hidden door to his safe room. He spoke about it with a tremor in his voice. It was the ultimate violation of trust. He recalled coming home one afternoon and finding her acting strangely. He could feel his own heart race just retelling it. She came down the stairs with this tight, unnatural smile and met him in the kitchen. Ah, hey, honey, he remembered saying, trying to keep things normal. How was your day? Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Fine. And yours? She leaned in for a quick, cold kiss. I got us some Thai, he told her, putting the bags on the counter. Pad see ew and crab rangoons, her absolute favorites. A week earlier, she would have been ecstatic. But now, he could practically feel her suspicion. What are you hiding? The very next day, she had a meeting with Mark Thorne. Eric, her family's lawyer, had given her the private investigator's name. Your mother swore by Mark's abilities, he'd told her. He's the best there is. Stephanie met him at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from anyone who might recognize her. Mark was already there, a man in his 40s with a gaze that seemed to miss nothing. Brandon eventually saw pictures of the PI. He wore a tailored blazer, an iPad sitting on the table in front of him. He stood when Stephanie arrived, shaking her hand with a practiced firmness. Stephanie, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, she'd said, sitting down and ordering a coffee she never touched. Mark got right to business. Your mother, Eleanor, hired me 6 months ago, he began, his voice serious. Mark laid out a story that Eleanor had suspected Brandon of embezzling from the family for years. He claimed he was hired to dig into it and had found everything. Hidden offshore accounts, shell corporations, forged documents. The PI showed all this supposed evidence to Stephanie, who, in her grief, just numbly told him, I've seen some things. Then Mark turned his iPad toward her. Your mother also had me monitoring his activities and his contacts. He showed her a photo on the screen. It was of Brandon and her sister, Jessica, at a little cafe. They were sitting close, and in the picture, his hand was covering hers on the table. Brandon told me his heart stopped when he first saw that photo in the legal discovery. It was taken 3 weeks ago, Mark said flatly. I have more just like it. Stephanie was just staring at the image of her own sister. How long? She whispered, her voice cracking. At least 6 months, Mark replied. But it's likely been longer. Your mother was just waiting for undeniable proof. Stephanie squeezed her eyes shut. The PI's voice softened just a little. This is a lot to take in. I can keep the surveillance active. My fee is $15,000. You'll get full logs, weekly updates, cash is preferred, and we can keep this completely off the books. She didn't hesitate. Stephanie pulled out a cashier's check she'd prepared that morning, using the last of her personal trust fund. $15,000. She slid it across the table. I want it all, Stephanie said, her voice hard. Everywhere he goes, everyone he talks to, I want his whole scheme exposed. The investigator, Mark, just slid the check into his coat pocket and gave a short, decisive nod. It's as good as done. That night, Brandon said, she locked herself in her late father's study and finally looked at their joint finances. For their entire marriage, she'd left the money to him. He was the one who was good with numbers. The realization of how much she'd just taken on faith hit her like a punch. She started scrolling through 2 years of their life together, transaction by transaction, an investment transfer for $8,500 on August 3rd, another for $6,200 on July 3rd, $10,000 more on June 3rd. It was a dark monthly ritual she was seeing for the first time. Every single transfer was labeled the same way, and every single one was processed on the 3rd of the month. She took the account numbers and checked them against the files the PI had given her. They were a perfect match. For 2 straight years, the man she thought she knew had been systematically draining their accounts right in front of her. She leaned back in that old chair, her hands trembling in the glow of the monitor. $850,000. And it was still happening. Brandon told me, his voice full of pain, that his own behavior that week had changed. He was trying to be more attentive, more loving, because he knew she was grieving her mother. He started bringing her coffee in bed, making her favorite meals, leaving flowers by her side of the bed. One evening, he started rubbing her shoulders while they were watching a movie. "You're so tense," Brandon remembered whispering to her, trying to ease the knots in her neck. "Are you doing okay?" The lie she told was simple. Just tired. His voice, he recalled, was full of genuine concern. "Of course you are. Losing your mom is a huge weight." He leaned over and kissed her head. "But I'm here for you. You know that, right? I'm not going anywhere." She gave him a small smile, but he later realized his touch must have felt repulsive to her. It was a textbook case of perceived love bombing. In his mind, he was creating a space of safety for his grieving wife. In her mind, he was preparing her to sign away her mother's $135 million estate without asking any questions. He was using her trust against her. He remembered Eleanor's final words to her daughter. "A man like that will never walk away from that kind of money." Playing along, Stephanie whispered back, "I know. Thank you." He gave her one last kiss before his eyes drifted back to the screen. Stephanie later admitted that she just watched his reflection in the dark screen during scene changes. His face was blank, detached, and cold. This wasn't the man she married. This was a predator who had been hunting her from the start. 5 days after her meeting with Mark, an email arrived. The subject was just 2 words, Update 1. Her heart pounded as she locked herself in the guest room to open it. Inside were 3 photographs. The first was of Brandon and her sister, Jessica, laughing at a cafe, Jessica's hand on his arm. The second was a closer shot, capturing Brandon leaning in to whisper something to Jessica as she smiled, looking completely captivated. The third photo took her breath away. It was a kiss. Not a friendly peck, but a passionate, deep kiss. The kind you only share with someone you're completely involved with. Stephanie confessed she stared at that image until it was just a blur of color and betrayal. Her husband and her sister. Mark's note was brief and brutal. 3 meetings this week. Same place, same table. The message went on. This pattern indicates an established, intimate affair, awaiting instructions. Stephanie slammed the laptop shut. She went into the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror. Her mother had seen it, had tried to warn her, and now the proof was staring back at her, ugly and undeniable. Brandon wasn't just after her inheritance. He was dismantling her entire life, and her own sister was helping him. But she didn't cry. Not a single sound came out. She just stood there, her hands gripping the marble countertops so hard her knuckles turned white. They thought she was a fragile little girl, lost in grief and easy to fool. They had no idea what she was about to unleash. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Mark. "Keep going. I need everything." The reply came back in seconds. "Consider it done." She collected herself, put her phone away, and went downstairs. Brandon was in the kitchen, humming as he poured 2 glasses of red wine. "Oh, there you are," he said with that gentle smile she used to love. "Want a glass?" She returned his smile with a terrifying precision. "I'd love one." He handed her the glass, his lips brushing her cheek. She took a slow sip, her eyes locked on his over the rim. He had absolutely no clue he was standing in the middle of a life she was getting ready to burn to the ground. As a counselor, you learn that every story has a starting point, a room where the trauma first took root. For Brandon, it was the wine cellar. He told me it was a place his wife, Stephanie, had refused to enter since her mother's funeral, a shrine to a relationship he could never fully penetrate. He spoke of how she'd describe her mom, Carol, moving through those shadowy aisles, telling stories about each bottle, her whole face lighting up. The last memory she had down there was of her mom holding a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux. "This one," Carol had promised, her voice full of life, "is for a truly perfect day. A real victory." That victory toast never happened. And this, Brandon explained, is where the story he was living in began to feel like someone else's nightmare. He had asked Stephanie to go down to that same cellar to grab a 1995 Opus One for some friends. It was a simple, thoughtless request, but he watched her freeze at the top of the stairs, her hand shaking as she reached for the light. He told me he saw a flicker of pure, animal terror in her eyes, something he couldn't understand. All she had to do was walk down, get the bottle, and come back up. She took a breath, hit the switch, and disappeared into the cold. He imagined the air hitting her, that heavy, cool scent of earth and oak that he knew she loved. Her mother had organized that cellar with an almost obsessive precision, a library of memories. He later learned that she found the Opus One right away, exactly where it should have been. But then, as her hand reached for it, her eyes caught on something a few feet away, a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, the celebration bottle, the one that was meant for a day that was stolen from them. That bottle was a monument to a future that had been annihilated by cancer. Brandon recounted how Stephanie described moving towards it, feeling pulled by an invisible string. He said she noticed it was sitting oddly in the rack, crooked, as if someone had pulled it out and shoved it back in without care. Then her eyes locked on the wax seal. It was cracked, and it wasn't the delicate hairline fracture of time. He told me she described it as a fresh, violent break. He pictured her lifting it into the light of that single hanging bulb. That's when she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible hole drilled straight through the wax, right below the cork. The kind of detail you would never see unless you were looking for it. A wave of sickness and dread washed over her. Brandon told me she left the Opus One right there on the floor, carrying the Margot upstairs like it was a sacred object, the key to some terrible truth. He only found out 3 days later that she had driven 2 hours to a private lab. The way he pieced it together later, she had called ahead, paying the entire testing fee in cash. She'd sold them a believable story, a worried collector afraid a prize bottle had been tainted, just wanting some peace of mind. They didn't question it. She walked in, handed over the bottle, and signed a waiver stating it was purely a private matter, completely unrelated to any legal action. The lab told her the results would be ready in 72 hours. Brandon described those 3 days as living with a stranger. He knew something was wrong, but she was a closed book, suspended in an anxiety so thick it felt like a physical presence in their house. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday. He was out running errands. She was in the study pretending to work. An unknown number flashed on her screen. A crisp voice asked, "Am I speaking with Mrs. Stephanie Clark?" I'll never forget the day Brandon first called my office. His voice was shredded, hollowed out by a horror he couldn't yet process. He said Stephanie had gotten a call from a Dr. Richardson at a toxicology lab. She had, without his knowledge, sent in a bottle of wine from her mother's collection. And the results, he said, were from a different planet. The doctor informed Stephanie that they had detected ethylene glycol, antifreeze. The concentration, Brandon whispered into the phone, was 40 milligrams per liter, a dose more than capable of killing someone. He sounded so lost, asking me, "Where does a person even come up with something like this?" He told me Stephanie had calmly asked the doctor just how deadly that amount would be. The doctor's reply was chilling. A single glass could cause total kidney failure within a day or two, especially for someone with a weakened immune system. And her mother, Carol, had been fighting stage 4 cancer. Her immune system was gone. To hear Brandon tell it, his heart shattered. He had loved Carol. The idea that Stephanie was constructing this narrative, this dark, twisted fantasy, was absolutely gutting him. Stephanie's next question to the toxicologist was even more disturbing. Would the chemical be detectable in an autopsy? The doctor apparently confirmed it would be, but only if they specifically tested for it within about 3 days of ingestion. After that, the compound metabolizes, becoming invisible, especially in a body already being destroyed by disease. Carol had died 3 weeks after the day she would have supposedly had that glass of wine. For Brandon, it was obvious. Stephanie was in the grip of a grief so profound she was inventing a crime to make sense of it. When Stephanie got off the phone, he said she just turned and looked at him. In that single moment, he watched the entire story lock into place behind her eyes. A monstrous fiction that her grief had authored, that he, her husband, had injected antifreeze into a priceless wine and served it to her dying mother, that he had sat by her bedside and watched her die knowing the doctors would blame the cancer. That look, he said, broke him in half. The last thing he said to me on that first call still haunts me. She looked at me, he choked out, like I was a monster. When Brandon first sat in my office, He told me his mother-in-law's kidney failure was meant to be the tragic end of her long battle with cancer. But for his wife, Chloe, it became the start of a story he could no longer be a part of. He recalled watching her that night, her face bathed in the cold blue light of her laptop, her expression hardening into something he didn't recognize as she descended into an online vortex, searching for symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning. Fatigue, nausea, confusion, they were all textbook side effects of the chemo. He could still see Stephanie, his mother-in-law, flinching after a sip of wine, and how they'd both chalked it up to the medicine already coursing through her. But in Chloe's mind, that shared memory was now being twisted into evidence. She saw the clinical progression online, organ failure, an erratic heartbeat, and it all seemed to connect the dots of every panic trip to the emergency room. He described the sound of the laptop snapping shut, a sharp crack that shattered the quiet of the room as her gaze fixed on him with a terrifying, unwavering certainty. Right there, in that moment, he was tried and convicted. She believed he had engineered her mother's death while she sat trustingly at the bedside, holding one hand, completely oblivious to the man she thought was a monster holding the other. A wave of sickness washed over Brandon. How could he possibly argue against a phantom? How do you assert your innocence when the person you love looks at you as if you are pure evil? And that's when the narrative, as he told it, veered into the truly surreal. Brandon described how Chloe returned to the wine cellar, her grief now weaponized into a chilling, methodical focus, like a detective revisiting the scene of a crime. She ran her fingers over the old wooden racks and, as if by magic, she found a loose stone behind the exact spot where that bottle of wine had been stored. He was convinced she had worked it loose herself, chipping away not just at the mortar, but at the foundations of her own sanity. Because inside that newly formed cavity, there was a perfectly folded piece of paper. It was a note, supposedly written in her mother's distinctive cursive. To Brandon, the whole thing felt too tidy, too staged. Chloe, it read, if you're finding this, I need you to check the 1982 Chateau Margaux. I suspect Brandon has done something to it. The letter then conveniently listed the very symptoms that had mystified the doctors, claiming her own intuition told her it wasn't the cancer. Brandon just stood there, speechless. It felt like a plant, a forgery created by a mind that was splintering under the immense pressure of its own grief. This is not the cancer, the note insisted, before disclosing the location of a secret panic room, with an access code tied to that exact bottle's vintage, 1982. You have to fight back, it pleaded, ending with a heart-shattering, I love you, Mom. Brandon watched Chloe sink to the cold stone floor, clutching the letter like a sacred text, a final testament from a mother who saw the truth. But all he could see was his wife, lost in a delusion she had meticulously constructed, manufacturing the proof she needed to set their entire life on fire. The scene just shattered him. In Chloe's version of reality, her mother was a fallen warrior, sending warnings from beyond the grave. And Chloe, she was the one who poured the poisoned wine, unknowingly serving as her husband's accomplice. He told me she just sat there on the cellar's damp floor for what seemed like hours. Then something inside her shifted. She got to her feet, her eyes fixed on the wall, and the code from the letter finally made sense. 1982, a flawless setup. Her fingers began to move along the necks of the bottles on the shelves. And of course, she located them. 4 bottles of that specific vintage, a 1982 sitting on the top shelf. She removed them in a sequence that felt almost choreographed. The first bottle, then the 9th, the 8th, and the second one. 1982. The moment she lifted the last one, a part of the wine rack glided back with a low rumble. Brandon swore he had no idea it was even there. It revealed a cold, steel door with a luminescent keypad. The entire situation felt like a complete fever dream. Her hand shook as she entered her mother's birthday, and the heavy lock clicked open with a deep thud. The door swung open to a small hidden room filled with emergency gear and one laptop. Affixed to its screen was another note in that same script. If you're reading this, I was right. Trust Eric. Don't let them get away with this. Brandon later asked me, his voice empty, who on earth is Eric? He'd asked Chloe the same thing, but she had just looked straight through him, her mind already in another world. It was obvious she wasn't acting on her own anymore. When the laptop lid opened with a soft click, the sound seemed to slice through the stale air of that secret room and sever Chloe's life in two. Glowing on the screen wasn't just information, but a carefully assembled case against him. Her mother's ghost had apparently built a digital fortress of files, a monument to her paranoia, or her genius. Chloe locked the room she hadn't known existed an hour earlier and walked back upstairs into a life that now felt like a lie. He was due home in 2 hours. She sat on their bed, the silence deafening, holding a new, terrible truth. Her husband, Brandon, had killed her mother, emptied their bank accounts, and was having an affair with her sister, Jessica. When he finally came home, her face was a mask of cold fury. I'll always remember Brandon telling me about that night. He'd stopped by a small wine shop on 8th Street to get a bottle of expensive Cabernet that he knew Chloe loved, clinging to a fragile hope that it might fix the growing distance between them. He said she'd been like a ghost in their apartment for weeks. He saw her across the room, texting her sister, Jessica, her thumb moving furiously across the screen with a look of grim determination. He told me, his voice breaking, that all he wanted was one normal dinner. But when she finally looked up at him, the smile she gave was a hollow, fragile thing. It broke my heart to hear him say it. He knew, right then, that she was performing, and he was the only person in the room without a copy of the script. For weeks, he'd been grappling with that chilling feeling of sleeping next to a stranger. And what we later discovered? My God, she had already put him on trial in her mind, branding him a monster whose life had to be systematically destroyed. The final push, the thing that sent her completely over the edge, came 2 weeks after that phantom dinner. We found out she'd hired a private investigator, a woman named Diane Foster, who sent her findings in an encrypted email. The subject line was pure theater. You must see this. She waited until Brandon was sound asleep, then hid in his own study like a foreign agent to open it. The email held 5 separate attachments. The first was a silent, low-quality video from the security system at the St. Regis Hotel. There was Brandon, walking through the lobby wearing the same dark suit he'd worn to a client dinner earlier that day. He sounded so incredibly weary when he told me this part, as if he were narrating a story that had happened to someone else entirely. He was just a man trying to hold his life together while his wife was paying a stranger to document its demolition. Moments later, the camera captured his sister-in-law, Jessica, entering the frame. He swore to me they had just gone to the hotel bar, desperate for a neutral space away from the crushing atmosphere at home. But the video told a different tale. The investigator had edited it, turning a simple conversation into a conspiracy. The clip showed them getting into an elevator together, then cut forward a full 4 hours to show them exiting that same elevator. Jessica's hair was disheveled, He was adjusting his tie. It looked precisely like what it wasn't, he admitted, his voice raw. He swore on everything he had that it wasn't what it seemed. There were two additional videos from different nights showing the same hotel and pushing the same damning story. Brandon just shook his head, replaying it not on a screen but in his mind. I messed up, he told me. I won't lie about that. Things with Chloe had turned to ice, and Jessica was falling apart. We found ourselves in the same foxhole. We made a mistake. One time, the other visits were me trying to fix it, trying to convince her we had to tell Chloe the truth. But when condensed into grainy footage, his clumsy attempts at honesty looked like a clear pattern of betrayal. The fourth attachment was an audio file. You could hear Brandon's voice, perfectly recorded. "Jessica, babe," he says, the sound of it a casual dagger. "I already told you, as soon as Chloe signs the estate transfer, we'll have access to all of it. Then we're gone." He swore to me it was a fabrication, his words cut and pasted together from a dozen different phone calls. He was panicked, a man forced to watch a deep fake of his own undoing. The voice on that recording, his voice, continued to promise her the world. Bali, the Maldives, wherever you want to go. Then you could hear Jessica's voice, quiet and anxious, asking what would happen if Chloe wouldn't sign. And then a laugh. A cold, hollow laugh that didn't belong to the man I was counseling. "Oh, she will. She trusts me. And if she gives me any trouble, I've got a backup plan." He insisted he had been talking about a corporate merger, about a contingency for liquidating stock if a deal fell through. But, edited that way, it sounded like he was planning to murder his wife Daunt Model. He couldn't stop saying the words. "Once Stephanie signs, I have a backup plan." Brandon told me that line, recorded by his wife, became the mantra of his undoing. This was so much bigger than an affair. A private investigator, Sarah Thornton, had crafted a story from that phrase. A story where he was a sociopath, methodically planning to kill Stephanie for her inheritance. Her report was his death sentence. The investigator's report, he explained, was a masterclass in character assassination. It twisted surveillance photos and a doctored transcript of that one phone call into a script for his own horror film. The story worked perfectly. He lost everything, including Stephanie. Sitting in my office, this man who was once so full of life looked like his entire world had been burned to ash by a meticulously told lie. The narrative the PI built was far more twisted than simple infidelity. Brandon described a report detailing a crazy, elaborate plot to force Stephanie to sign away her inheritance. The supposed leverage was her own sister, Megan. The story claimed she was deep in debt, $120,000, to a vicious loan shark named Rico, a man with ties to organized crime. The debt was spiraling, and she had just 30 days. The deadline was October 12th, 2025. I remember Brandon's hand shaking as he recounted it. The PI had photos of Megan meeting Rico and an informant who allegedly confirmed the debt, the deadline, and the threats. The report positioned Brandon as the villain orchestrating it all, using his sister-in-law's terror to strong-arm his wife into liquidating her family's estate. He was trapped in a story that made him a monster. In this narrative, Megan was painted as either a victim or a co-conspirator, now caught up in felony fraud. What started as a domestic issue had been deliberately escalated into a federal crime. The PY's report ended with a chilling recommendation. Local police were not enough. With organized crime and offshore accounts involved, the FBI had to be brought in immediately. I encouraged Brandon to consider Stephanie's perspective. Imagine her reading that report. Her sister owes a gangster $120,000, and her husband is using it as a weapon. He'd allegedly offered Megan a piece of the inheritance for her help. And if Stephanie refused, Brandon had his backup plan. He confessed he knew Stephanie's mind would leap straight to her mother's mysterious death, the sudden kidney failure, the hushed rumors of poison. The narrative then shifted, but Brandon had pieced together what happened next. He imagined Stephanie meeting the PI, Sarah, in some cheap diner, the air thick with tension. He saw Sarah, looking exhausted, sliding that folder of lies across the table. In his mind, Stephanie numbly says, "I'm going to the FBI." And he pictured the relief on Sarah's face, her mission accomplished. "Good," she'd say. "This is wire fraud, conspiracy, maybe murder." "This has to be federal," he imagined Sarah insisting. When Stephanie asked if they'd believe her, Sarah would have laid out the evidence, a lab report on a wine bottle, photos of the affair, and that recording of his so-called backup plan, right after he supposedly tried to swindle her out of $1 million. "Oh, they will believe you," she would have assured her. He pictured Stephanie staring at her hands, watching her life crumble based on a lie. Then, he told me, his thoughts would always turn to her sister. He imagined Stephanie asking, "What about Megan?" He could almost hear the PI's calculated pity. "She's being manipulated, but she's still an accomplice. Brandon is their real target. He's the architect of this whole thing." It was a perfect trap. Then Sarah would have added one last piece of bait. "There's this man, Rico. If Megan doesn't get that money to him by October 12th, he's going to hurt her. Badly," the investigator would have warned. "Bringing in the FBI could make it worse for her at first. You need to be ready for that." In that fabricated moment, Stephanie was forced to see her sister as both a co-conspirator and a potential victim, all at Brandon's hands. She made her choice, he imagined Stephanie saying, her voice cold. The decision was made. He pictured her on the phone with her lawyer, Michael. "I need a meeting with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He could hear Michael's hesitation, warning her that this was a point of no return. And her final, devastating reply. "Michael, I'm convinced he murdered my mother, and I believe he's planning to murder me." 3 days later, her reality became a scene from a movie. She was led into a sterile, windowless room in a federal building, a place designed to make you feel small and powerless. After navigating layers of security, a junior agent escorted her up 14 floors. It was all part of the performance of intimidation, setting the stage for the story she was about to tell. Michael was there, a steadying presence beside her as two men in dark suits faced them. The senior agent, in his late 40s, introduced himself. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Special Agent Davis, white-collar crime. This is Agent Clark from the SEC." Stephanie shook their hands. Davis's grip was firm, his eyes assessing. He was a man who had already seen it all and was rarely surprised. So she sat in that cold government room, presenting the shattered pieces of her life to these two men. Clark, the younger agent, immediately started noting things on a tablet. Davis began, his voice professional. "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Miller. I know this is difficult." Stephanie just nodded, overwhelmed. He assured her she was safe and not in any trouble. "We believe you have information vital to an ongoing investigation," he said. Stephanie found her voice. "My lawyer indicated you were already investigating my husband." This, she told Brandon later, was when the world tilted on its axis. The agents exchanged a look, and Davis dropped the first bomb. "We have been," he confirmed, "for the last 8 months." Then came the knockout blow. "The man you know as Brandon Miller has been a person of interest since January. Here's the problem," Davis continued, leaning in. "We didn't know his name was Brandon Miller until your attorney contacted us." The words hung in the air, nonsensical. "I don't understand," she managed to say. Davis held her gaze. "The man we've been tracking, he goes by the name Alex Vance." The name was meaningless to her. "He poses as an independent financial advisor," Davis explained. "It's his cover." "In reality," Davis stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "he is a professional con man. In the last 5 years, he's defrauded at least 22 victims of over $12 million. $12 million! At his cue, Clark put an image on a monitor. It was a complex chart of names and accounts, a dark map of all the lives he had systematically destroyed. It was Brandon's entire secret world, laid bare. In my line of work, you see the moment the world shatters for someone. For Stephanie, it was in a sterile government office, watching a chart on a screen map out a web of lies. Cayman Island accounts, shell companies, forgery so perfect they were almost art. I remember her telling me about it. "He's smooth," one of the agents, a man named Davis, had admitted. "But the net's been tightening." Stephanie said she felt the air literally punch out of her lungs. She whispered the horrifying truth that was dawning on her. "So, Eric Shaw and Brandon Miller, they're the same person." Davis just nodded. Eric was the con man, Brandon was the man she loved, and it was all a performance. "We never pieced the two together," Agent Miller had told her, explaining the breakthrough. "Not until your lawyer called with the information from your private investigator. The offshore account numbers you found, they were an exact match for our case." Stephanie told me she gripped the table so hard her knuckles went white. The man she shared a bed with wasn't just cheating, wasn't just stealing. He collected lives. He was a predator who had been hiding in her home. She then asked the question that I know must have felt like swallowing glass. Who are the other women? Davis swiped the screen and a list of figures appeared, names blacked out for privacy. $480,000, $620,000, $1.2 million. It was staggering. "Mostly widows," Davis said gently, "or women fresh from a nasty divorce. People who'd suddenly received a lot of money and were in a vulnerable state. He finds them, earns their complete trust, then convinces them to let him invest their futures. I've seen this pattern. He wasn't just a con man, he was a psychologist, weaponizing empathy. Then he washes the money through his offshore labyrinth and disappears." Miller finished. Stephanie's blood ran cold. She told me she flashed back to the months after her first husband died, the crippling fog of grief. And how, 6 months later, Brandon had appeared. He felt like a miracle then. "He targeted me," she said, the words landing with the force of a physical blow. "Yes," Miller confirmed, his voice grave. "You were his perfect profile, a grieving widow with a large inheritance. To him, you weren't a person. You were a business plan." A deep, profound sickness rose in her. "Here's our problem," Miller continued, pulling her back to the grim present. "We can nail him for securities fraud, no question. But that carries, 10 to 15 years max. With a good lawyer, he's out in 5. 5 years." The number was an insult. 5 years? Stephanie echoed in disbelief. For destroying over 20 lives and stealing $12 million? I know, Miller said, and she saw real anger in his eyes. The justice system for white-collar crime can be a joke. Unless, he added, his voice low, we can get him for something much, much worse. Something that guarantees he never walks free again. Stephanie met his gaze, and I can only imagine the hardening in her eyes, the birth of a resolve she never knew she had. She then spoke the word that had been a dark shadow in her mind for weeks. Like murder. Miller didn't even blink. Like murder. With a hand that didn't shake, she pulled a small USB drive from her purse and slid it across the table, followed by a lab report and a stack of surveillance photos. My mother died 3 weeks before Brandon and I got married, she began, her voice cold as steel. The official report said cancer complications, but I know he poisoned her. That wine bottle is from her house. It has ethylene glycol in it, antifreeze. The lab confirmed it. Davis grabbed the report, his eyes scanning it before passing it to Miller. The senior agent read it twice, his face a mask. This is definitely enough to launch a homicide investigation, he finally said. But it's not enough to convict, Miller had to add. Why not? She demanded, the frustration tearing at her. Because the poison is in the bottle, he explained patiently. But we can't prove it was ever in your mother. She died 3 weeks later. Any trace would be long gone from her system. We can't prove she drank it. And even if we could, we can't prove Brandon was the one who put it in there. He was methodical, a ghost who left no tracks. In my line of work, you meet people whose lives have fractured in ways you can barely imagine. I often think about a man I worked with. Let's call him Brandon. He truly believed he had it all, this perfectly curated life. He had no idea that while he was at work one day, that entire world was being methodically taken apart in a cold government office. His wife, Stephanie, sat across from an agent named Thompson, who was explaining just how thin their case was. We have no prints, no one saw anything, and no confession, the agent said. But Stephanie's certainty was absolute. I know it was him. Thompson nodded, playing the part of the sympathetic listener. I believe you, he said. But my belief doesn't hold up in court. His lawyer would tear our case apart with reasonable doubt. They were missing the one piece that could lock the door on him for good. A confession. The agent looked straight at her and asked her to do the unthinkable. Get Brandon to confess on tape. He told her if she could get a clear admission of guilt, they could ensure he never walked free again. A life sentence for first-degree murder. How? Was the only thing she could choke out. That's when Thompson laid out the trap, a terrifying psychological game where she would be the central player. Another agent came in to show her the official paperwork for a federal wiretap. The operation was already a go. They were asking for her consent to rig their home, Brandon's sanctuary, with hidden cameras and microphones. They wanted to listen to every word, every sigh, while she orchestrated conversations meant to back him into a corner. The truly terrifying moment came when she asked if she'd have to keep living there with him. Thompson's answer was blunt. For a short time, yes. He didn't try to soften the blow, stating plainly that the danger she was in was off the charts. He told her that if Brandon got even a whisper of a suspicion that she knew, the situation could become violent in a heartbeat. But he promised her round-the-clock surveillance with a tactical unit just minutes away at all times. The second she activated a distress signal, they would breach the house. I can only imagine the storm in her mind, images of her mother, of the 22 other victims, of the monstrous lie her marriage had become. Then, with a chilling calm forged in grief and anger, she looked at the agents and asked the one question that sealed Brandon's fate. "What do I need to do?" With an expression that allowed no misunderstanding, Agent Miller laid out the script that would ultimately trap the man she married. She was to go home and act like the loving wife she had always been. One hint of fear, one flicker of doubt in her eyes, and the whole thing would be over. Her own lawyer, a man named Mark, gave her an out, a final chance to walk away. But her decision was made. "I'm in," she told them. And with that, the die was cast for Brandon. The pace was stunning. From a theoretical plan to a full-blown operation, it took less than 48 hours. On a Tuesday, Stephanie found herself in the quiet of an FBI building, listening to Agent Miller's detached voice as he recited legal jargon over the phone to a federal judge. Words like probable cause and imminent threat, even the terrifying phrase conspiracy to commit murder, echoed in the room, all directed at the man whose pillow was next to hers. She remembered the judge's approval coming through just after noon. Miller turned to her, his face impassive, and said, "It's done." He ran through the warrants as if reading a shopping list. Their house, Brandon's car, his cell phone, and even her sister Jessica's apartment. She just numbly took it all in. The tech team was set to arrive at 9 a.m. the next day. They just needed a 3-hour window where the house would be empty of Brandon. She had the perfect reason. Going through her recently deceased mother's belongings. "I just need the house to myself for a few hours," she told him. And Brandon, playing his role as the supportive husband, never questioned it. He accepted her story without hesitation, even mentioning a client meeting he had in the city that would fit her timeline perfectly. He gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead, and he was gone by 8:45. At exactly 9:02, two plain white vans pulled into their driveway. The man I came to know had no inkling that the foundation of his world was being systematically dismantled. Four men, dressed more like internet installers than federal agents, moved through Brandon's home with a silent, unnerving precision. Stephanie described watching from the front lawn as these strangers methodically violated the private space she had shared with him. Agent Miller remained at her side, a steadying presence in the midst of the surreal scene. "2 hours, max," he promised her. "He'll never know we were here." Her deepest fear was that Brandon would somehow discover one of the devices. But Miller calmly explained that the technology was practically invisible, smaller than a Tylenol, completely wireless, and field-tested for 5 years without a single instance of being found. As he was saying this, she saw one of the agents unscrew the base of Brandon's favorite reading lamp, placing a tiny silver disc inside its core. The technician reassembled the lamp, and it turned on just as it always had. It was horrifyingly simple. In their living room, another agent was focused on the smart TV. When Stephanie asked, Miller explained he was overriding the device's firmware. "The camera and microphone are already built in," he said, matter-of-factly. "We're just gaining access." That feeling of violation, she later told people, was like a physical illness. Her home, the one place she was supposed to feel safe, had been transformed into a sophisticated surveillance hub. Still, she held on to the belief that this gut-wrenching betrayal was the only path to getting justice for her mother. By 11:30, the team had vanished. Miller debriefed her on the device placements: the lamp, the TV, a smoke detector, and a final bug planted beneath the dashboard of Brandon's sedan. From that second forward, they were listening, 24/7. Every conversation, every unguarded moment was being recorded and analyzed. She asked about his phone. That's already live, Miller told her, holding up a tablet that showed Brandon's entire digital life, his texts, his calls, and his real-time GPS location. He'd been compromised that very morning through a phishing link disguised as a notification from his bank. The trap for Brandon was now fully armed. And then, the first lie unraveled. As she stared at the tablet, she saw the last text Brandon had sent her. Heading into the city, client meeting at 11, love you. The glowing dot on the map, however, told a completely different story. He was at a small cafe, not even 15 minutes from their house, nowhere near San Francisco. Stephanie's questioning gaze met Miller's. He isn't meeting a client, the agent said grimly. He's with your sister. Miller then presented a surveillance photo taken just 10 minutes before. It showed Brandon sitting across a small table from Jessica, his hand resting on top of hers with an intimacy that felt, she said, like a punch to the stomach. The world literally tilted. We have eyes on him, Miller said, his voice low and steady, every single move. Her life as a federal informant started right then, in that cold, sterile FBI conference room. Miller was direct, making it clear that this would be the most difficult performance of her life. She had to go back to their home and resume her role as Brandon's loving wife, to smile at him, to share a bed with him, all while carrying the secret belief that he was a killer. The second he suspects anything, Miller warned, this is over, and your safety could be compromised. She insisted she could do it, but he pushed, needing absolute certainty that she understood what she was becoming. You are not his wife anymore, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You are an undercover operative. You have to inhabit a new identity. The sheer force of will it must have taken for her to meet his gaze and say, I can do this, is almost beyond comprehension. He finally relented, on the condition that she follow his rules without deviation. He laid out the 5 commandments of the operation. First, she had to compartmentalize all her feelings and become a dedicated performer. Second, she was forbidden from confronting Brandon, no matter what he said or did. Third, a panic button was her one and only lifeline if he became violent. Fourth, she was to document any strange behavior using pre-established code words. And fifth, the most important rule of all, they had exactly 2 weeks. October 8th was the final day. Whether they had a confession or not, the operation would be terminated. Miller then handed her a small silver locket, opening it to reveal a tiny red button inside. Your lifeline, he called it. Hold this down for 3 seconds and a team will be through your door in less than 5 minutes. The locket, he continued, was also a live microphone and a GPS tracker that she was never to take off. The cold metal against her skin must have felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Miller's final instruction was the most critical. She had to get Brandon to discuss his plan to transfer her mother's estate into his name. She had to pretend to be interested, ask questions, and act as if she was seriously considering it. She had to act willing to sign her entire inheritance over to the man she suspected of murder. It was a monstrous thing to ask, but her mother's last words echoed in her mind. Don't let them win. She agreed. When Brandon's car pulled in at 6 o'clock, the familiar sound of the garage door sent a wave of pure terror through her. She stood in the kitchen, repeating a silent mantra. You're an actress. Just breathe. Brandon came inside with a warm smile, asking about her quiet day. She somehow mirrored his expression, assuring him it had been both relaxing and productive. He seemed to have no suspicions at all. He kissed her cheek, a casual gesture that made her skin crawl, but she didn't flinch. As he poured 2 glasses of wine, his back to the smart television, she could almost feel the unseen eyes and ears of the federal agents as they watched her opening scene unfold. I remember Brandon recounting how distant Stephanie seemed that evening. He told me she simply rolled over in bed, saying she was wiped out and felt a sore throat coming on. His concern was real. He felt her forehead for a temperature, adjusted her blankets, and lay there in the quiet, attuned to her breathing, with no idea the woman beside him was, in spirit, a total stranger. In his version of reality, she was the woman he adored. He had no way of knowing she was wide awake next to him, viewing him not as her husband, but as the architect of her mother's ruin. He couldn't have guessed she was gripping a small silver locket beneath the sheets, a talisman in a performance for an audience he couldn't see. For him, the night was like any other. And a week into her silent torment, Brandon made his move over breakfast. He recalled sliding a thick stack of legal papers across the breakfast table while pouring her coffee. He was proud of this moment. Thinking about the future, he'd announced with that easy smile of his. We should probably consolidate our assets, make it all joint property. It's better for taxes, and it's a safety net. If anything happens to one of us, the other is set. In his mind, he was being the perfect responsible husband. He described watching her gaze fall on the documents that contained her entire legacy, her mother's trust, the real estate portfolio, the family company. He saw her knuckles whiten around the handle of the coffee pot. I'm not sure, Brandon, she finally said, her voice tight. This was my mom's whole life's work. He told me he reached for her hand, his voice gentle. I get that, but we're a unit now, Stephanie. What's yours is mine. And what's mine is yours, he'd added, framing it as the ultimate act of partnership. That's what marriage is. But she pulled her hand away. As she sat, she said she needed to review it all first. He admitted to me a surge of annoyance. He was on a schedule, but he suppressed it. Of course, honey, take whatever time you need, but let's try to be quick. Harrison needs them filed by the end of the month. A quick kiss on her forehead, and he left for the day, feeling he'd handled it with perfect finesse. He left her in the echoing silence of their kitchen, alone with a pile of papers that felt less like a partnership and more like an ultimatum. He was oblivious to the fact he'd just opened the scene for a federal wiretap. He told me he came home early that day, a bad feeling churning in his gut. He found Stephanie in the living room, a book open in her lap that she clearly wasn't reading. He skipped the small talk. Did you look over the documents? He asked, walking into the room. He recalled her composure was unnerving. I'm getting to it. It was then, he said, that his own composure began to fray. Stephanie, he pushed, a new hardness in his tone. It's been 6 hours. What's taking so long to read? He walked toward her, standing over her chair, needing a resolution. You just have to sign them, he said, his voice low and firm. We're husband and wife. It's what we do. When she asked for just a couple more days, he told me something in him just broke. He brought his fist down on the coffee table next to her. The sharp sound made her jump. Are you saying you don't trust me? He challenged, his voice almost a whisper. He knew he'd crossed a line, but the pressure was immense. He would later describe that as the moment he saw her begin to crumble. No, Stephanie whispered, her voice unsteady. Of course I trust you. It's just with Mom being gone. And just like that, His anger evaporated. He was no longer looking at a defiant wife, but a daughter lost in grief. Seeing the conflict in her eyes filled him with a sudden, sharp guilt over his own impatience. He finally backed down. "I'm sorry," he said, and he truly thought he was. The caring husband role snapped right back into place. "I shouldn't have pushed so hard," he murmured. "I know it's a lot to process. Just think about it. We're in this together." She gave a small nod and promised she would. After kissing her forehead, he couldn't help but add one last thing. "But, Stephanie, we do need to get this finalized." Her only response was, "I know." He left her sitting there, convinced, as he told me, that they were back on the same page. He was completely unaware that the smart TV on the wall was an active witness, that the FBI had just recorded the entire volatile exchange. A little later, needing privacy for a call, he went to the garage, got into his car, and shut the door to keep from being overheard. The call lasted maybe 2 minutes before he came back inside. He yelled up the stairs that he was going for a run to clear his head. She replied with a simple, "Okay," and he was out the door. From his perspective, he was a guy managing a high-stakes financial deal and a grieving wife. He had no clue that the second he left, a secret burner phone was bringing a hidden world to life. The short call from his car was to her sister, Jessica. It was only through legal discovery that I learned what the federal agents had captured. And Agent Miller was on the line with Stephanie, telling her he had a recording she needed to hear. He sent the encrypted file. She pressed play and heard Brandon's voice, terrifyingly clear, speaking to her own sister. "Jessica, we've got a situation." What Stephanie heard next was Brandon venting his frustration, complaining she was getting hesitant about the paperwork. He sounded agitated, telling Jessica about a tight deadline and how some guy named Tyler Mason needed the funds freed up in 11 days. Then came the phrase that tore her world apart. He told Jessica that if Stephanie didn't sign by next week, they'd have to move to Plan B. And her own sister's voice came back, chillingly composed. "Plan B?" Jessica asked. "The wine cellar? The same approach you used with Sarah?" When that recording was played in court, a profound silence consumed the room. I heard my friend's voice, cold and clinical, outlining how to stage a murder as a tragic accident. Carbon dioxide. He laid out the whole horrific scenario. How she would fall unconscious. How they would wait before calling 911. He even bragged. It wouldn't be the first time. My entire understanding of him shattered. The awful reality settled over everyone in the room. Brandon had murdered her mother, and Stephanie was his next intended victim. She got Agent Miller on the phone, who confirmed her deepest terror. "We have his confession," Miller said bluntly. "Conspiracy to commit murder, we have him." She begged them to arrest him immediately, to just end the nightmare. But the agents explained that a good lawyer could easily argue the recording was some kind of sick joke. "We need him to make an overt act," Miller explained. They required something more concrete. And that's when they proposed one of the most dangerous and courageous sting operations I've ever heard of. They asked her to be the bait. They wanted her to lead Brandon down to the cellar, to make him think his plan was actually unfolding. Agents would be hidden everywhere, ready to intervene the moment he acted. The second he makes a move, we're going in, Miller promised. They gave her a panic button, a micro camera, and every reassurance they could muster. He was clear that she could say no, that no one would make her do it. But really, what other option did she have? She thought about her mom, Sarah, and everything she'd already endured. She knew she had to see it through. "When does this happen?" she asked. Miller told her it would be soon, within 48 hours. The whole time, my friend, the man I thought I knew so well, was walking deeper and deeper into a trap he couldn't even imagine. When Brandon got back from his run, he found her upstairs. "Honey, I'm back," he called out. He said she came out a minute later, her face looking like she just splashed it with water. He didn't know she'd just been looking at her own reflection, hardening her resolve, telling herself she wasn't a victim anymore, but an asset in an investigation. She met him in the kitchen, where he was dripping with sweat and chugging a bottle of water. He told me a huge smile lit up his face when he saw her. "Hey, you okay?" Unbelievably, she managed to smile back. "Yeah," she said. "Just tired. Did you think any more about the papers?" He said he had. She walked right up to him, put a hand on his arm, and said the words he was desperate to hear. "You were right. We're a team. I'll sign everything. Just let me have till the weekend." He described the feeling as pure relief, like the sun finally breaking through. He was so happy. He probably called me right after that to say things were finally falling into place. He was completely oblivious that he'd just been given his own final deadline. "You really mean it?" Brandon asked, pulling her into a hug. He recalled to me how her entire body felt rigid in his arms. "I think I'm just going to turn in," she told him, stepping back. "It's been a long day." "Sure, okay," he said, letting her go. "I'll be up in a bit." He would never realize that when she closed the bedroom door that night, she engaged the lock for the very first time. She was preparing for what was coming in 2 days. The day she would help the man she married try to murder her. 2 days before the operation was scheduled, Detective Harris took Stephanie to a protected location. It was a secluded ranch tucked away in the hills, a full hour's drive north of the city, completely isolated with blacked-out windows and no formal address. He had her leave her car on a desolate dirt road and walk the last stretch on foot, a detail that was later meticulously documented in every single official report. Her closest friend, Eric, who also served as her attorney, was already at the precinct. He asked her, "You hanging in there?" She was falling apart inside, of course, but managed a faint nod as they reached the office door. Detective Miller opened it before they even knocked. The room felt less like a workspace and more like a war room. Schematics of Brandon's entire property were spread across a long table, surrounded by open laptops and stacks of surveillance shots. 3 other officers in civilian clothes were gathered around the table, the coiled wires of their earpieces the only sign of their real jobs. Miller gestured toward 2 empty seats. "Have a seat. We don't have much time." Stephanie sat, and Eric took the chair beside her. The detective pushed a booking photo across the table, a man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and deeply haunted eyes. "This is Vince Gallo," Miller said flatly. His day job was managing a local funeral home. But my client's case file showed he was deeply corrupt into everything from insurance fraud to forging death certificates for people who were very much alive. His professional license had even been suspended before being quietly reinstated in 2022. "What's his connection to all this?" Stephanie asked. "He's Brandon's problem solver," Miller answered, sliding a printout of a text exchange toward her. A few weeks back, Brandon had messaged Vince. 50,000 in cash, same kind of job as last time. A deep sense of dread washed over Stephanie as she stared at the words. "We brought Vince in yesterday," Miller continued. They had him cornered in the embalming room of his own business, giving him a stark choice: become a state's witness against Brandon for a reduced sentence, or go down with him for conspiracy to commit murder. He folded instantly. So, he's on your side now, she said, more a statement than a question. He is, Miller confirmed, and we have someone ready to fill his shoes. Stephanie just looked at him, her mind reeling at the thought of an imposter. Miller detailed the entire operation. An undercover officer would impersonate Vince. When Brandon called for a cleanup, their agent would be the one to pick up the phone, with the entire conversation being recorded. It was the last, crucial piece of evidence they needed. He then turned a laptop to face her, showing a satellite view of her home, pockmarked with small red icons. Here's the operational plan, he said. Sunday, 1800 hours. You're going to suggest opening a very specific bottle of wine, he instructed. One stored in the cellar. Brandon will have to go down with you. He zoomed in on the cellar's floor plan. His intent is to lock you in, compromise the ventilation system, and flood the room with carbon dioxide. We are certain this is his method. The file notes say, just like Sarah. It's how he operates. Stephanie could only nod, her knuckles bone white from clenching her fists. Only you won't actually be in there, Miller assured her. You'll be inside the panic room your mother had built. The door is hidden by the wine rack. The entry code is 1982. And you'll use the escape tunnel that leads to the gardener's shed. He pointed to another red marker on the screen. We'll have 2 agents waiting right there. They'll escort you out. The whole escape was designed to take less than 3 minutes. All the while, Brandon would be upstairs in his home office, watching what he thought was a live camera feed of her losing consciousness. He would likely give it 20, maybe 30 minutes to be absolutely sure. Then, he'd make the call to Vince. The undercover cop would answer. Brandon would fully incriminate himself, and the trap would spring shut. The instant he places that call, we breach, Miller said. 6 agents in full tactical assault gear. We take him into custody on every charge. It's done. Stephanie's eyes were glued to the screen, to those 6 tiny red symbols representing armed men. But what if it doesn't go right? She whispered. Miller's face was like stone. It will. We've run 47 sting operations just like this. We have never had a civilian casualty. We're giving you a panic button, he added. You will have armed agents less than 50 yards from you at all times, and you have an exit strategy your husband knows nothing about. But what if he decides to check on me himself? She asked, her voice trembling. What if he doesn't call Vince? What if he just walks away and leaves me? He won't, Miller said, with the weight of absolute certainty. He understands that a body discovered in his own wine cellar is an unacceptable risk. He needs her to disappear, Detective Miller stated, his tone sharp in the quiet of the station. That's why he keeps a guy like Vince on his payroll. He will make that call. They knew they could likely charge Brandon with kidnapping and attempted murder, with the evidence they already had. But Stephanie, his voice softened. That phone call is the key. It's the difference between him serving 15 years and him dying in a cell. She squeezed her eyes shut, weighing 2 different kinds of justice. 15 years. He could even get out in 10 with good behavior. But a life sentence was a guarantee of justice, a finality. It meant Brandon, the man she had promised her life to, would die in prison. I understand, she managed to say. Miller pushed a 10-page document toward her across the cold table. It was a federal waiver for her cooperation in the operation. He explained it was merely standard procedure, a formality to acknowledge the inherent risks. Hand that here, Eric, her lawyer and oldest confidant, said, cutting in. He took the forms, his friendly demeanor vanishing as he slipped into his professional role, his eyes scanning every line of the fine print. After a few silent, heavy moments, he looked at Stephanie. "It's a standard release," Eric confirmed. "You're formally acknowledging the risks involved. That, while the Bureau has a duty to protect you, they can't promise your absolute safety. If the operation went wrong, but the agents had followed their training, she would have no basis for a lawsuit. If they were negligent, the waiver wouldn't matter." Her eyes met Detective Miller's. "Has anyone ever gotten hurt doing this?" He answered immediately. "Not in a controlled sting. We've had suspects get spooked and had to call it off, but we have never, ever lost a cooperating witness. Not one." Stephanie reached for the pen, her hand shaking. Eric placed his hand over hers. "You are not required to do this," he said, his voice a quiet, urgent plea. "We can hit him with a civil case over the fraud. It's not life in prison, but—" "No," she cut him off, pulling her hand away. "This is about my mother. He needs to pay for what he did to her. I want him to spend the rest of his life in a cage." She put her name on the line, the date clear beneath her signature. October 3rd, 2025. Eric signed his own name as the witness. Detective Miller gathered the signed documents. "All right," he said, his tone shifting back to business. "Sunday night, 6 o'clock. Are you prepared?" Stephanie's mind went to her mom, to that secret room, to the letter that pleaded with her to be brave. "When do your agents get into position?" she asked, her voice now hard as steel. "Tomorrow evening," Miller told her. "They'll come in disguised as a landscaping service, or maybe cable technicians. By Sunday, that house will be the most secure location in the state. You won't be able to see them, but they'll be there." Eric stood up and pulled her into a tight embrace. "Your mom would be incredibly proud of you," he murmured. But the drive back was a lonely return to a life that was now a complete performance, one she had to maintain until the very end. And there was Brandon, the man who had been my patient, watching a football game as if nothing was wrong in the world. "Hey, you were out late," he said, his focus still on the screen. "I had a therapy session," she replied, the fabricated words tasting like poison. "Just working on a few things with Dr. Peterson." He got up and kissed her on the forehead, a gesture of affection that felt entirely empty. "Are you feeling any better?" "I am," she lied a second time. "I was actually thinking maybe we could open that amazing bottle of wine on Sunday as a sort of toast to a new chapter for us." Brandon's face lit up with a smile that was so genuine, so terrifyingly warm. "You're serious?" "I am," she said. "The 2005 Camus, the one Mom was holding on to." "Ah, I would really love that," he said, his smile radiating pure, innocent joy. His performance as the devoted husband was perfect, but she later told detectives that, for the first time, she could see the fractures just beneath the surface. "Sunday evening, then," she confirmed. 6 o'clock. It's a date." She went to her room, locked the door, and just stared at the wall calendar. 48 hours. In just 2 days, the man she had once trusted with her life was going to try and murder her. From what Brandon recounted to me in our sessions, he staged that final night with a heartbreaking attention to detail. He grilled their favorite cut of steak with roasted asparagus, and even decanted a bottle of Pinot Noir an hour early so it could open up. It was just the two of them at the dinner table, the candlelight dancing between them, when he reached across and took her hand. "This is just perfect," he told her. "Just the two of us." It was the image of a perfect marriage, and it was all a lead up to a single question. Have you had a chance to think about that paperwork for the estate? Stephanie, with a composure that still astounds me, kept her voice perfectly calm. I'll take care of all of it tomorrow, Brandon, I promise. His entire face brightened with what she saw as a sick kind of joy, but what he described to me as pure relief. As she started to clear their plates, she laid her final piece of bait. I was thinking we should open that 2005 Cabernet you adore, the one Mom saved. His smile was immediate. Really? That sounds amazing. I'll run down and get it. But she put her hand on his arm, a final, perfectly staged touch. No, you handled dinner. It's my turn. Let me get the wine. He kissed the back of her hand, he remembered, and said, Okay, but don't take too long. As Stephanie turned and walked toward the cellar, her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm she felt sure he must have heard. The small silver locket she wore, which was actually a panic button, was ice cold against her neck. A 3-second press to activate, a 5-minute response time. Not yet. The stairs led down into a cool, waiting blackness until the motion sensor lights came on, revealing the endless racks of wine and the heavy steel door he had installed for her mother's collection. That's when she heard him, the familiar weight of his footsteps on the old floorboards above her. It was Brandon. Stephanie, he called, his voice oozing a fake concern that I now recognize as a hallmark of his condition. He stood as a dark shape at the top of the stairs, blocking the light. Hey, let me get that for you. He moved toward her, and she managed a tight smile, insisting she was fine. But he didn't stop, and as he reached the bottom, his eyes went straight past her, locking onto that solid steel door. What she told me happened next is the scene that plays in my mind when I can't sleep. Brandon just turned around, walked back up the stairs, and then Stephanie heard the sickeningly final sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. She was sealed in. Her voice shook as she called out to him, asking what he was thinking. His answer, cold and distant, crackled through a small intercom. I'm so sorry, Steph. This is just how it has to be. Then, a faint hissing began to snake from the vents. She felt the pressure shift in her ears. She hurled her body against the door, her hands beating a frantic rhythm on the cold metal as she screamed for him. Silence. The hissing got louder. The forensics team later confirmed my worst fears. Brandon, the man I tried to help, was flooding that sealed room with carbon dioxide. This wasn't some sick game. Her screams were real, her knuckles splitting as she begged, the very air turning against her. She was fighting for her life against a man I thought I knew. The gas, being heavier than air, would rise slowly from the floor. The experts gave her 3 minutes, maybe less. She had to fight back the wave of sheer terror and lunge for a wine rack, recalling a strange conversation where her mother had pointed out 4 specific bottles of 1982 Chateau Margaux. That's not just a good year, honey, her mom had said, a look on her face she didn't understand at the time. It's your escape route. Stephanie's fingers found the bottles, pressing them in the sequence her mother had drilled into her memory. 1, 9, 8, 2. A deep grinding sound filled the chamber as the whole rack shifted, uncovering another steel door with a lit-up keypad. She frantically typed 0614196 her mom's birthday. The lock clicked open, and she stumbled into a tiny 8 by 10-foot safe room. Dim emergency lights flickered on, revealing oxygen tanks, a laptop, and a small safe. Affixed to the computer was an envelope bearing her name in her mother's beautiful handwriting. Stephanie, it started. If you're reading this, then I was right about him. He actually went through with it. My dear girl, I am so sorry. The note laid out the entire awful truth. Her mother had known she couldn't prove what Brandon was capable of. So she had built her daughter an escape. A 50-foot tunnel led from that room to the groundskeeper's shed. Don't you dare stop running, the letter pleaded. Listen to Spencer. Listen to the FBI. You have to finish this. You are stronger than he will ever be. Don't let that monster win. Stephanie told me she just slid to the floor, holding that letter, and let out one raw, broken sob. She shoved the note in her pocket and found a metal plate set low on the opposite wall. Prying it open revealed a dark, tight passage with small lights glowing every 10 feet or so. She grabbed an oxygen mask, looped it over her neck, and forced her trembling body into the claustrophobic 3-foot-high tunnel. The only thing she could hear was the sound of her own breathing and the rough scrape of her clothes on the concrete. 50 feet might as well have been a marathon. At 10 feet, then 20, her body was screaming. At 40, she finally saw a sliver of light from a trapdoor above. Shoving it open, she was hit with a blast of cool air as she scrambled out of the ground and into the arms of two men in full tactical armor. An FBI agent caught her as her legs gave out. "You're all right," he said, his voice steady and grounding. "You're safe now. We've got you." It was only in that moment, safe in the dimly lit shed, that Stephanie finally triggered the distress signal on her locket, holding the button for 3 long seconds. The agent spoke into his radio. "Asset is out. I repeat, the asset is secure, awaiting the signal to proceed." As she sat on the dusty floor, shaking, an agent gave her some water. She found enough voice to ask if Brandon had called Eric yet. The agent, listening to his earpiece, gave one quick nod. "He's on the phone with him as we speak. Our contact is recording the entire conversation." In the house above, Brandon was staring at a blank screen, the camera feed from the cellar showing nothing, and he was completely oblivious. I'll never be able to unhear that recording of Brandon's call. He told me he stared at his laptop for almost 30 minutes before he could dial. "Eric, it's over," he said, his voice flat, completely empty. "I need you here in 20. He recited his rehearsed lie with zero emotion. A freak carbon dioxide leak in the cellar. How he couldn't get a pulse on Stephanie for 25 minutes. He told Eric to bring the van, to be quiet. The plan was chillingly precise. $50,000 cash, nothing that could be traced, and she was to be cremated by morning. After the call, Brandon went down to the wine cellar, the space he intended to be a crime scene. He shut off the gas and then stomped on the security system's hard drive until it was nothing but shattered plastic. He carefully wiped down every single surface. Wearing gloves, he disturbed expensive bottles of wine, creating the scene of a desperate, failed rescue. He stepped back, a dark sense of pride washing over him. It looked perfect. A tragic, unavoidable accident. Brandon was absolutely convinced his narrative would work. A terrible accident from a faulty vent. He was untouchable. He went upstairs to wait for Eric, his fixer. Exactly 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the trees as a dark van came up the drive. A small smile touched Brandon's lips, but it disappeared when the side door slid open to reveal 6 federal agents, tactical vests on, weapons all pointed directly at him. His first thought was to run, but when he turned back to the house, he ran right into Agent Miller, blocking his path. Brandon Pierce, Miller said, his badge catching the light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Stephanie Pierce. All the color washed out of Brandon's face. The body cam captured his stammered reply. I don't know what you're talking about. As two agents cuffed him, forcing him to his knees, Agent Miller got close. We have everything, he said in a low voice. The audio, the video from the panic room, the call you just made, and your wife. She's alive. Brandon's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a desperate disbelief. She's alive, Miller said again, and she's going to be in court every single day, watching you get put in a cage for the rest of your pathetic life. Wrapped in a blanket near the entrance to the driveway, Stephanie watched them force Brandon, the man she'd promised to love forever, into a federal car. Their eyes met for a split second. His were filled with a pitiful mix of shock and betrayal. She just stared back, giving him nothing but cold silence as the car drove off. Agent Miller came over with a water bottle. "We got him," he said, his voice gentle. Stephanie could only nod. The words stuck in her throat. Spencer, a dear friend of her mother's who helped coordinate the entire sting, put an arm around her. "It's done," he whispered. "It's finally over." Stephanie's eyes stayed on the house, her childhood home, the same place that had just saved her life. "Yeah," she finally whispered back. "It's over." The whole operation, the takedown of a man I had spent months trying to understand, was finished less than 20 minutes after she'd escaped. I found out later that Stephanie watched the whole arrest from an unmarked car parked down the street. The black van Brandon had paid $50,000 for showed up right on schedule, but Eric wasn't driving. The FBI had picked him up 3 hours before, and he'd given them everything they needed almost immediately. So, when that van arrived, it wasn't there for a body. It was there to close the trap. 2 undercover agents, looking like morgue attendants, got out with grim professionalism. Next to Stephanie, Agent Miller held a tablet showing a live feed from cameras they had planted weeks ago. On the screen was Brandon, the man I knew as my client, standing on his porch, sipping a drink, not even moving toward the van. He just watched from about 30 feet away, playing the part of a husband too shattered by grief to get any closer. The undercover agents came out carrying a black body bag, filled with 80 pounds of sand and containing a cashmere coat Stephanie owned, a gift he had given her for Christmas. As they loaded the gurney into the van, Stephanie saw Brandon's entire body relax in relief. He was certain she was dead. "That son of a," she breathed. "He's not even putting on a show," Agent Miller noted, his voice flat. "Most of these guys at least pretend for the cameras we all know are there." The van pulled away, supposedly taking his wife's body with it. Brandon watched it vanish down the road before he turned and went back inside without a second glance. A couple of minutes later, the audio feed on the tablet came to life with Brandon's voice, and it was chillingly upbeat. "It's done," he said to someone on the phone. "She's finally gone. In my line of work, you hear stories that stay with you. Brandon's is one of them. He told me it started with a single sentence whispered into his phone. 'We're finally free.' I can picture him, standing in the quiet house he'd shared with his wife, listening to the crackling voice of his mistress, Jessica, asking if he was absolutely sure. 'I'm positive,' he'd told her, his voice sharp. 'The team just left. It was clean.' He then laid out his plan to play the grieving husband, to liquidate everything she owned. It was a chilling performance, even in the retelling. And then, 'We can finally leave,' Jessica had whispered back to him over the phone. A recording of that call was played for his wife, Stephanie, weeks later. And then we leave, Brandon confirmed, savoring the words. It was right at that moment, as he detailed their new life together, that Stephanie heard the unmistakable sound of a champagne cork popping. He was toasting her death. The agent with her, Thompson, cut the audio. "Are you okay?" he asked. She wasn't, but she gave a small nod. For the FBI's plan to work, Stephanie had to remain a ghost. They moved her to an anonymous little ranch house in Sonoma, a full 60 miles away from the life she knew. It was a carefully chosen location, far from Brandon's influence and in a totally different jurisdiction. From the outside, it was just another suburban home, but every window was reinforced with bulletproof glass. Her husband had made her a prisoner in her own life, and now she was a prisoner in her own safety. When she arrived, her best friend, Eric, was already there, pacing like a caged animal. The moment he saw her, he just collapsed into her arms, holding on like she might disappear. "Thank God," was all he could get out, his voice thick with relief and fear. I heard Agent Thompson's voice in the background of a later recording, a clipped report to his team. "The package is secure." Stephanie tried to reassure her friend, whispering, "I'm okay." But it felt hollow. Eric saw right through it. "No," he said, his voice gentle. "You're not." Agent Thompson, ever the professional, broke the moment. "We need to go over the plan." The weight of it all seemed to hit Stephanie at once, and she sank onto the sofa. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely there. He estimated 10 to 14 days. "Brandon thinks he's gotten away with it," Thompson explained, "and this is the part that always gets me. That's going to make him feel invincible. It's going to make him careless. He'll talk to Heather," Thompson predicted, referring to Stephanie's own sister. "A man this arrogant has to brag to someone." I now understand that someone would eventually include me in a very different context. "What we need," he continued, "is a confession on tape for what he did to your mother and for the plan to ruin you financially." Stephanie looked confused. "But you arrested him." That initial arrest in the dark of her wine cellar was only for the attempt on her life. And this is the detail that tears you apart. That single charge might only get him 10 years. To make sure Brandon never saw the outside of a prison cell again, they had to prove he'd murdered her mother, Carol, and prove the vast financial fraud. The horrifying truth of the situation finally landed on her. "You let him go." Thompson's expression gave nothing away. We had no choice. His lawyer was already yelling entrapment, and she wasn't the only one. A subsequent investigation found a list of at least 22 other women Brandon had systematically conned and ruined over the years. "If we don't do this by the book," Eric urged, "he walks in a decade and just finds his next victim." Stephanie saw her mother's face in her mind, and she could almost hear her voice telling her not to let him win. Just then, Thompson handed her a garment bag. "No one can recognize you. If Brandon got even a hint that she was still alive, the whole operation would be for nothing." Inside the bag was a wig, a severe dark brown bob. There was an envelope with a pair of plain glasses and a brand new driver's license for a woman named Emily Carter. It also contained $5,000 in cash and a clean, untraceable phone. "You stay here," Thompson instructed her, his voice firm. "No social media. Don't even Google your own name." As far as the world is concerned, Stephanie Hayes died in a terrible accident on October 4th. A new, terrifying thought cut through her numbness. "What about my funeral?" she asked. Eric and Thompson exchanged a heavy look. We're staging one, Thompson said. It will be a closed casket. Brandon will be there playing the grieving husband. She pictured it. Pictured Brandon, the man she'd loved, standing over an empty plot of land, performing his grief for all their friends, for her family, taking their hugs and their condolences. Good, she said, her voice turning to ice. Let him dig his own grave. Later that evening, she locked herself in the bathroom and started cutting her own hair. It was a small act of defiance, a way to take back some control. The scissors were cheap and dull, and the cut was a jagged mess. But hidden under that dark wig and behind those glasses, she was a stranger. Emily Carter looked exhausted and forgettable. Stephanie Hayes was gone. She held onto the bathroom sink, and for the first time, she allowed herself to cry for her mother and for the person she used to be before Brandon. When she finally came out, Agent Thompson was watching a wall of surveillance monitors. He glanced up. Brandon just sent a text to Jessica. They're meeting tomorrow. A restaurant in the city. It's public. He's smart enough not to talk inside the house he assumes is bugged. Stephanie's voice was a faint whisper. What do you think he's going to say? Thompson's face was grim. We're about to find out. My bet, he said, is that he's going to celebrate his victory, and when men like him celebrate, they get sloppy. She sat next to him, her eyes locked on the monitor showing her husband's face, the man who had murdered her mother. I'm a ghost now, she said quietly, the words just hanging in the silent room. Thompson looked at her, his expression unreadable. Are you ready for that? She thought about the letter her mother had left, the secret panic room Carol had installed in the house years before Brandon ever came along. Her mother had known. She had tried to warn her. Yes, Stephanie said, her voice suddenly strong. Let's hear what the living have to say when they think the dead aren't listening. 5 days after that, Brandon held a funeral for her. She watched the whole sick performance from 60 miles away, huddled on a beige sofa in the safe house, a laptop streaming the memorial live. Agent Thompson had set up a multi-camera feed from 6 different hidden spots around her property, capturing the scene from every possible angle. Even though she was completely alone in the room, she still wore the brown wig and the heavy glasses. She told me later that the disguise was a shield. It helped her create a necessary distance from the horror on the screen. You don't have to watch this, Thompson had told her gently from across the room. Yes, she insisted, her eyes fixed on the laptop. I do. On her screen, 40 people were gathered on the same patio where they'd held her mother's service just 8 weeks earlier. The same chairs, the same beautiful, painful view. But there was no coffin. Instead, there was a huge smiling picture of her from a trip they had all taken 2 years ago, back when life felt normal. And Brandon, my future client, stood beside it in a perfectly fitted black suit, his face a flawless mask of a man shattered by grief. He had the performance down to a science. My dear friends, Brandon began, his voice catching with expertly feigned emotion. Thank you for being here. It means the world. Stephanie would have... He let his voice trail off, his shoulders shaking with theatrical sobs that sent people in the front row scrambling for tissues. She would have wanted something small, he finally choked out. She never liked being the center of attention. It was the only true thing he said that entire day. The rest was pure fiction. He spun a beautiful, tragic love story for them, quoting poets I know he'd never read, and talking about shared dreams that he had invented for the occasion. It was a masterful portrait of a perfect marriage that had never existed. And clinging to his arm through it all was Heather, her own sister, playing her part as the devastated but supportive sister in law. Every time Brandon's voice would break, she'd squeeze his hand, murmuring words of comfort just out of range of the microphones. It was a disgusting, loyal performance. From the safe house, Stephanie felt a surge of rage. "Stay calm," Thompson murmured. The whole pathetic memorial was done in under 30 minutes. After a short poem and a story from a business partner, the guests were led inside for drinks. Brandon was serving them wine, her wine, from the very cellar where he had left her to die. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of that man was something I would come to know all too well. Miles away, her lawyer Eric was focused on a different monitor. "Garden, southeast corner, now." A new camera angle showed Brandon and Heather hidden away near the rose bushes, out of sight of the other guests. A hidden mic picked up every word. "I can't believe we actually pulled that off," Brandon said. His voice completely changed, a smug smile spreading across his face. Heather looked nervously over her shoulder. "Are you sure she's gone? Are you positive you checked?" Brandon's tone turned cold and irritated. "I was down there with her for 25 minutes, Heather. She didn't take another breath. Mike even confirmed it when he came for the body." I saw the surveillance footage much later, but the way he grabbed his accomplice's wrist said everything. "But what if," she started to say, but Brandon cut her off with a vicious "Stop." His grip was brutal. "It's done." The woman, Ashley, just stared at him, maybe trying to find the man she thought she knew before she surrendered. "Right. Okay." Then her tone shifted. "So, when do we get the money?" A slow, triumphant smirk spread across Brandon's face. "Mark has the transfer scheduled for early next week. All I have to do is sign the papers as the devastated, grieving husband. $135 million, he whispered, like a prayer. "It's all ours. We cash out every asset, dissolve the company, and we're on a beach in the Caymans by Thanksgiving." But Ashley still looked nervous. "What about the investigation?" Brandon just laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The SEC? The identity Kevin Price stops existing the second Stephanie is declared dead? New names, new accounts? They'll never find us." And that's when Ashley began to laugh, a wild, unhinged sound. "We're really doing this." "We already did," he replied simply. Then he kissed her, a deep, possessive kiss, standing right there in her own mother's garden. All while, less than 100 yards away, 40 people who thought they were mourning my client Stephanie were drinking his wine. Miles away, Stephanie snapped the laptop shut. The only sound was the hum of a small fridge. Agent Miller was silent. Mark, her lawyer, looked like he was going to be sick. "Well," Miller finally said, "that's that. A confession to murder, to fraud, and to conspiracy. They had him dead to rights." "You've had him since the wine cellar." Stephanie's voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you make me watch that?" It was her lawyer, Mark, who answered, his voice incredibly kind. "Because you had to see it, to see him for who he really is. So you'd know for the rest of your life that you weren't crazy. You were right." She went to the window, staring out at the rolling hills. 60 miles away, Brandon was at her memorial, shaking hands, accepting condolences for her death, all while dreaming of how he'd spend her money. "When do you arrest him?" she asked, her back still to them. "Next week," Miller said. "The second that transfer goes through." We're going to let him sign his own confession on every single document. Then we'll take him. The list of charges against him was a legal avalanche. We were talking attempted murder, conspiracy, securities fraud on a massive scale, and grand larceny. Brandon, the man who sat in my office talking about his anxieties, was looking at a life that would start and end in a federal prison. His partner, Ashley, wasn't getting away either. Her part would earn her at least 25 years. I remember learning all this as the sun went down, the sky painted in colors too beautiful for such an ugly story. Just 5 days before, Stephanie had clawed her way out of a hidden passage, escaping the tomb Brandon had built for her. Now, she was a ghost, attending her own funeral, forced to watch the man she loved bury a box of air. "He actually thinks he's won," she had whispered to Mark. "Let him," Mark had replied. "For now." In the background, Agent Miller was rewinding the feed to their conversation in the garden. Brandon's voice, cold and final, filled the room. "She's dead. It's over." Stephanie told me that was when she finally turned away from the window, her eyes locking on the frozen image of Brandon and Ashley kissing next to her mother's prize-winning roses. "It is not over," she promised herself. "Not by a long shot." 8 days after watching her own memorial service, she watched them pop champagne. From inside a federal safe house, she had a live feed of their sick celebration. The penthouse was one of those sterile modern places, all white leather and glass walls looking out at the Bay Bridge. The kitchen was so clean. You knew no one had ever even made coffee in it. This apartment was a secret life Stephanie never knew existed. I had to ask, how long had this gone on? Agent Miller told me the lease had been active for the last 3 years. 3 years. He had rented it under the alias Kevin Price, that fake identity he was so proud of, paying in cash twice a year. Federal agents had wired the whole place for audio and video the day before. 3 years. A whole secret world. An entire universe of lies packed into 900 square feet. On the monitor, Stephanie saw Brandon unlock the door with Ashley right behind him. He was still wearing the suit from the funeral. His tie finally loosened. The second the door clicked shut, Ashley kicked off her heels and flopped onto the couch with a dramatic sigh. "God, I thought those people would never leave," she moaned. Brandon walked straight to the kitchen and pulled a bottle of Dom Perignon from the fridge. Stephanie recognized it instantly. It was the same vintage she'd bought for Ashley's birthday 2 years ago, along with the same crystal glasses she'd given her as a housewarming gift. He described pouring the champagne, a flute for him and one for Stephanie. "To us," Brandon told me he'd said, lifting his glass. "To $135 million. To our future." Stephanie's glass met his, but her smile was a ghost. "I just can't believe she's really not here anymore," she'd said. Then asked about the wine he'd given to Jessica's mother, Carol, a vintage bottle. Brandon let out a laugh in my office, the same bone-deep, chilling laugh he'd let out then. "It was perfect, wasn't it?" he said, recounting his genius. "The chemical he used, ethylene glycol, is untraceable after just 72 hours. When Carol finally passed, the coroner listed kidney failure from her ongoing cancer as the cause. He'd injected the toxin right through the cork 3 weeks earlier. In the surveillance video, you could see Stephanie's hand fly to her mouth, fighting back sickness. "And I'm the one who poured it for her," she whispered, the horror of her part in it finally sinking in. "Symmetry," Brandon had mused, taking a slow, satisfied sip. In his retelling, he was unstoppable. "Carol thought she was so clever, changing the will to cut me out. But She underestimated me. I never lose. Stephanie set her glass down then, her entire posture shifting. Can I ask you something about the baby? Brandon's face, even as he recalled it, tightened. That was 18 months ago, Stephanie. We moved past that. I know, but her voice had wavered. Jessica drove me to that clinic. She held my hand in the waiting room, telling me how strong I was. The tears were streaming down her face in the video. And the entire time, I was getting rid of our child. In the safe house, the real Jessica said the room felt like it was folding in on itself. Agent Harris had to put a hand on her shoulder. Jessica, breathe. Just breathe, was all Jessica could manage, her own voice a stranger's. On the monitor, Brandon was pulling Stephanie into a hug. We couldn't have a child while I was married to her. The timing was impossible, you know that. But you promised. Stephanie's voice was muffled by his jacket. You said once we had the money. And we will. Brandon had cut in smoothly. A new start, new names, the family we always talked about, everything we planned. But she had to go first. Stephanie pulled away, her eyes pleading with his. Don't you feel anything? Any guilt at all? He told me he actually considered it for a second before shaking his head. Guilt is for people who have other options. I didn't. Carol was going to destroy me, report me to the SEC, freeze my accounts, put me in a cage. And Jessica, he'd added with a shrug, like it was a minor detail. She would have put it all together eventually. I saw the look in her eyes after the will was read. The wheels were spinning. So you killed her, Stephanie had whispered, horrified. So I set us free, Brandon corrected, his voice gentle. He had cupped her face, kissing her forehead. For 3 years, we've been trapped. 3 years of stolen weekends and lies. They were the best years of my life, Stephanie, and now we get forever. When she kissed him back, a frantic, desperate kiss sealing their toxic bond, Jessica had to look away from the screen. Agent Harris paused the recording. That's an 18-minute unsolicited confession, he said flatly. The murder of Carol Sullivan, conspiracy to murder you, admission of financial fraud, the affair, the abortion. Combined with the estate papers he signs next week, this case is airtight. But Jessica wasn't hearing him. Her gaze was locked on the frozen image of them on her sofa, beside champagne glasses she had bought. Her sofa, her sister, her husband. She drove me to the clinic, Jessica repeated, her voice hollow. I remember that day. In my line of work, you hear stories that stay with you. Brandon's was one of them. He told me Stephanie's pregnancy was the result of a terrible breakup, claiming the baby's father wanted no part in their life. I remember him describing how he brought her soup, how he stayed with her all night. Eric, their family lawyer, sat with us once, head in his hands, insisting, Jessica, you couldn't have known. But I later learned she held Stephanie's hand, her voice breaking, realizing, while she was pregnant with Brandon's child. The silence that followed that revelation was heavier than anything I've ever felt. The federal agents had a plan. We'll make our move next week, Agent Davis explained to her. We need him to sign every single document. The complete estate transfer, the forged signature, the wire fraud. We have to let him see the crime through. He promised an airtight federal case. No chance for bail, no loophole. She had to ask, her voice barely a whisper. How much time will he actually get? Agent Davis's response was absolute. Life, with no possibility of parole. We have him on murder 1, attempted murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud and identity theft. And so, Brandon Miller, a man I once tried to counsel through what I thought was grief, is almost certainly going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Stephanie, the woman he drew into his darkness, is looking at 25 to 30 years as his accomplice. All this while his wife Jessica, the woman everyone thought was gone, just gave a quiet nod, looking out at the distant hills. 60 miles from there, Brandon and Stephanie were celebrating with her champagne, lost in a twisted fantasy where they actually thought they had gotten away with it. I have to be there, Jessica insisted, her voice suddenly like iron. When you take him? I saw the report on this later. Even a seasoned pro like Agent Davis looked uncomfortable. Jessica, that's highly unusual, he tried to explain. I need to see his face, she shot back. The agent who recounted this to me said the look in her eyes when she turned from the window settled the argument instantly. I want him to know I'm alive. I want him to know that he failed. Davis and the lawyer, Eric, just exchanged a look. We can make that happen. Eric finally agreed in a hushed tone. And just like that, Jessica turned back to the window. It had been only 8 days since she'd clawed her way out of a shallow grave. Now, she was hidden in a government safe house while her own funeral was being planned, having just listened to Brandon confess to things no human should ever endure. The ghost, as she had begun to call herself, was getting ready to return. So, 12 days after his wife was supposedly murdered, Brandon Miller strode into Eric's office to claim everything she had ever owned. And the whole time, Jessica was watching. She stood in an adjacent room with Agent Davis and a few other agents, staring through a brand new two-way mirror. The mirror had been installed just 3 days earlier, when Eric conveniently moved his practice to a sterile, nondescript building near the federal courthouse. The entire office was a stage, a flawlessly designed trap. The heavy mahogany desk, the obscenely expensive leather chairs, the 60-page stack of legal papers, every detail was a carefully placed prop. Brandon looked perfect, utterly composed in a navy suit Jessica had bought him, fresh haircut, polished shoes. He walked in and gave Eric a broad, grateful smile, playing the part of the grieving husband holding it together. Thinking about the man I saw in my office, it still makes my stomach turn. Hey, thanks again for moving on this so quickly, Brandon said, easing into a chair. I know these things can drag on for months. Eric's tone was perfectly professional. Given the circumstances, I felt it was best to expedite everything. He then opened a leather folder and slid a single document across the gleaming desk. The first document is the trust transfer, Eric began. $47 million from the Catherine and Jessica Sullivan Trust, which will be moved to you as the sole surviving beneficiary. Brandon picked it up, and from what I was told, his eyes went straight to the final number. Jessica swore she saw his pupils physically widen. It was the raw, unmasked face of his greed. And what's the status of the real estate? He asked. Eric slid 3 more pages his way. The Napa estate and the 2 New York apartment buildings are being signed over to you. You can expect to hold the full clear titles in about 10 business days. Brandon's question was more of a statement. That depends on court approval, but that's just a formality, right? Eric's lie was as smooth as glass. In a situation like this, yes. With an uncontested will and no other living relatives? Brandon cut in. Besides Stephanie. But she has already received her $500,000. Eric gave a small, formal nod. That is correct. The rest of the estate is yours. Right beside Jessica, Agent Davis was murmuring into his radio. Subject is now reviewing the financial transfer paperwork. All units, get ready to move. A source told me she pressed both hands flat against the cold glass, just watching Brandon skim the pages, not reading the words, only hunting for the dollar signs. $47 million, 18 million, 12 million. The family winery, the life insurance, everything she and her mother had worked so hard to build was now just another number on a list for the man I once tried to help. Eric slid the final document over. And this last one is for the life insurance beneficiary. $5 million, currently in escrow, which will be released to you once the death certificate is officially filed. A huge, triumphant smile slowly spread across Brandon's face. And what's the timeline on that? He asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the most, Eric promised him. I've already sent the certificate of death to the insurance company. Every single word was a perfectly constructed lie. The certificate was a forgery, provided by a medical examiner who was part of the federal investigation. The insurance company was playing its part in the sting, but Brandon was completely oblivious. All he could see was another $5 million about to land in his account. So, where do I sign? He asked, his excitement practically vibrating in the air. Eric handed him a pen. It was a cheap, disposable thing, the kind you'd find at a bank counter. It looked like nothing, but in that moment, it was the final nail. With every signature, 3 tiny cameras hidden in the ceiling recorded his every move. I learned later that the conference room was wired for sound and video from every possible angle, capturing his face, his hand, the documents that were sealing his doom. Eric, the lawyer Brandon trusted completely, tapped a finger on the first page. Initial here and here, he directed. Brandon signed instantly, his signature big and bold. On the line that named him the sole heir to the Sullivan fortune, he signed it with an arrogant, self-satisfied flourish. Brandon Miller. He signed the form to wire millions into a secret account. He signed and dated it. Brandon Miller, October 16th, 2025. He flew through the entire stack, one incriminating page after another, 60 pages of massive fraud written in cheap blue ink. Agent Davis was reportedly on his radio, calling out the federal offenses as Brandon committed them. 18 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of identity theft, 4 counts of conspiracy. The arrest team started to check in. Their voices were calm, professional. Team 1 is a go, Team 2 in position, Team 3 standing by. Brandon got to the very last page, looked up at Eric, and let out a quiet, deeply satisfied sigh. "Ah, is that all of it?" he asked, a smug little smile on his lips. "That's all of it," Eric confirmed, his voice completely flat. "The estate is now officially yours?" Brandon leaned back in the expensive chair, looking exactly like a man who believed he had just committed the perfect crime. "You know," Brandon said, his voice dripping with condescending pleasure, "Stephanie always said you were the best lawyer in the state. I'm glad she was right." He picked up a signed page, just staring at the number at the bottom. $47 million, 3 properties, the entire company. "This should have been mine from the start," he muttered. And Eric, to his credit, played his part until the very end. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "Catherine never liked me," Brandon said, the old bitterness rising up. He wasn't even looking at Eric anymore, just talking to the piece of paper in his hand, completely lost in his own warped story. "She always thought I wasn't good enough for Jessica. She even tried to get her to sign a prenup, tried to keep me out of the family business." A small, cold smile appeared on his face. But Jessica trusted me. She put my name on every single account, gave me total control. Honestly, she made all of this incredibly easy. On the other side of that glass, Jessica was digging her nails into her palms so hard she almost drew blood, doing anything to keep herself from smashing through the door. Agent Davis had to put a steadying hand on her shoulder. 60 seconds, he whispered to her. In the conference room, Eric calmly gathered the signed documents and put them in a folder. I'll file these with the probate court first thing tomorrow. You should see the first of the trust assets transfer within 10 business days. In the lawyer's office, Brandon pushed his chair back, extending a hand to Mark. Mark, thank you again for all of this. The lawyer held his hand just a beat too long. Jessica would have wanted this process to have some dignity. Brandon's response was so practiced, it was terrifying. She was an incredible woman. She deserved a much kinder fate than the one she got. As if her death was some cosmic accident he had nothing to do with. He turned to go, clutching that folder of documents like a championship trophy. I was told Mark waited until Brandon's hand was on the doorknob before his voice cut through the silence. Brandon. My former client paused, glancing over his shoulder. Yeah? Mark's face was stone, but his voice was ice. One last thing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has some questions for you. The door opened, but it wasn't the empty hallway he was expecting. That's when Agent Harris stepped into the doorway, flanked by 4 other agents in tactical gear. Their firearms were holstered, but their presence stole all the oxygen from the room. Brandon froze, the color draining from his face until it was a sickly white. Brandon Harrison, Agent Harris announced, holding up his badge like a death sentence. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit murder, and the murder of Jessica Hayes. Brandon's jaw fell, then snapped shut. His eyes darted from Mark to Agent Harris, then to the one-way mirror, a horrifying realization dawning on him that his wife was right there, watching. This is ridiculous, he managed to say, his voice thin. Jessica is gone. As her husband, I'm entitled to. Harris's voice cut him off like a razor. Jessica Hayes is very much alive. As a matter of fact, the agent said, his tone utterly flat. She has been a party to this entire meeting. The blood completely vanished from Brandon's face, leaving behind a raw, primal terror that must have been unforgettable. That's impossible. I saw her. As if summoned, the conference room door opened. And there she was. I wasn't there, but everyone agrees it was a moment of reckoning so intense it burned itself into their memories. For a stretch of time that Brandon described as an eternity, the world just stopped. He saw Jessica's lawyer, Mark, frozen, a leather-bound folder still in his hand. The man's mouth hung open, his skin turning a waxy, corpse-like gray. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect, awful photograph of the moment the master manipulator had to face the ghost he was so sure he'd created. He painted the picture for me. His eyes were locked on Jessica, his mind, as he put it, literally blue screening as it tried to process the impossible. Ghosts don't just walk into corporate law offices. They don't wear simple black dresses and the pearls that belong to their murdered mother, their eyes glowing with a cold, righteous fury. But she was there. No, was the only word Brandon could push out as he stumbled backward. No, you can't. You're dead. I saw you. Jessica just held his gaze, letting the silence stretch as she counted in her head. 1, 2, 3. He remembered his hand flying to his own chest, a desperate reflex to stop his heart from exploding. I saw them load your body into the van. He stammered. My contact confirmed it. 4, 5, 6. This isn't real, he rasped, his voice shredding with pure panic. 7, 8, 9. After 10 seconds that felt like a lifetime, Jessica finally spoke, her voice like a shard of glass. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see, Brandon, she said. A dead wife, a clear path to my inheritance, the freedom you were so desperate for. At that moment, the door opened again. 2 federal agents escorted Stephanie, Jessica's sister, into the room. She was in the same clothes from the video, her mascara a mess of black streaks. When she saw Jessica, a raw animal scream ripped from her throat. "Oh my God!" she gasped. "Oh my God, you can't be real." "Oh, but I am," Jessica said, her frozen gaze shifting to her sister. Stephanie flinched as if she'd been hit. "I'm alive, Stephanie. Surprise." The younger sister's eyes darted between Jessica, Brandon, and the agents, her brain failing to compute. "I don't understand," she whimpered. "The funeral, the body bag." Jessica cut her off without mercy. "Sand," she said flatly. "The body bag you cried over was full of 80 pounds of sand inside my old coat. The funeral director you thought Brandon bribed? He was an FBI agent, the medical examiner who signed my death certificate, an FBI informant. It was all a play, Stephanie, and every single line was written just for him." Brandon just kept shaking his head, backing toward the wall like a cornered animal. "You can't do this. I'm your husband." "You tried to murder me," Jessica shot back, her voice finally cracking with the impossible weight of his betrayal. He told me, with a strange sort of pride, that he hated that he could still get that raw emotion from her. "You locked me in our wine cellar. You flooded it with carbon dioxide and watched me die on a security monitor. You called a fixer to dispose of my body before I could be found." Brandon stopped, his eyes scanning the room, hunting for one person, anyone, not looking at him with utter disgust. "It's a setup!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking with disbelief. "My attorney will tear this whole thing apart." The agent, a calm man named Thompson, just looked at him and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Your attorney," he said evenly, "will probably tell you that claiming entrapment doesn't work so well when you've already committed a string of felonies. Brandon Clark, you're under arrest for the murder of Carol Hayes, the attempted murder of Stephanie Hayes, and about a dozen other charges. You have the right to remain silent." Another agent began the familiar script. "This is insane," Brandon bellowed. And for a second, he actually lunged toward his wife, Stephanie. 2 agents blocked him instantly, their hands going to their service weapons. "You snake, you set me up!" As Brandon told it, Stephanie met his rage with an unnerving calm, her voice quiet but sharp. "No," she said. "You built your own trap. I just handed you the rope." Agent Thompson snapped the cuffs on Brandon's wrists. The metallic click seemed to echo in the room, a sound of absolute finality. He thrashed against their hold, but it was useless. His face twisted into a snarl of pure, helpless anger. "You think you're so smart," he spat at Stephanie. "This isn't the end. I'll prove what you did." "You can't prove anything," Stephanie cut in, her voice like ice. "Because we have an 18-minute recording from your apartment, the one where you admit to killing my mother with antifreeze, to trying to poison me. You talk about the affair, her pregnancy, all of it. We have it all on tape, Brandon. Every single word." The fight just drained out of him then. The apartment, he whispered, a fresh wave of sick realization washing over him. You recorded me in my own home. All under a federal warrant, Agent Thompson clarified, his tone flat. We got it 8 days ago. Every conversation you had in there, everything you did, is evidence. And it's all admissible in court. From across the room, I remember Brandon describing a small, strangled noise from Stephanie's sister, Ashley. Stephanie turned to her, her expression now hollow. I'm your sister, Ashley whimpered. You stopped being my sister when you helped him poison our mom, Stephanie replied. I was the one who held your hand when you went to that clinic, Ashley. I stayed up with you all night. I brought you soup and swore it would all be okay. And the whole time, you were hiding that you were getting rid of his baby. Ashley just crumpled to the floor, sobbing into her hands. I'm so sorry. I didn't want any of this to happen. Oh, you wanted it, Stephanie shot back. You wanted every last bit of it. She knelt down, getting right in her sister's tear-streaked face. Every lie you fed me, every secret you buried, every dollar of my inheritance you were planning to steal. You knew exactly who he was, and you still chose him. Another agent approached with a second set of cuffs. Ashley Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and being an accessory. You have the right to remain silent. Ashley didn't fight. She just knelt there limply as they cuffed her. Brandon told me he was still screaming, just a stream of denials and curses that no one was listening to. As they were both pulled from the room, Brandon struggling, Ashley completely limp, he saw Stephanie's iron control finally break. She'd done it. Her wild, unbelievable plan had actually worked. But in that moment of victory, she looked completely shattered. He found out later that as soon as the door shut, her lawyer, a guy named Mark, put a hand on her shoulder and just said her name. She tried to answer, but all that came out was this broken sob, and then another, until she was just clinging to him, finally letting herself collapse. It's over, he whispered into her hair, a final hollow declaration. It's all done. You won. But from everything I came to understand, it wasn't a victory. It was the crushing weight of loss. For her mother, the sister she thought she knew, and a marriage that had been a phantom all along. It was a grief so deep it had no bottom. She cried until there was nothing left, her body aching with the steep price of her own survival. After the initial storm, an agent laid out the rigid path ahead for Stephanie. Her husband, Brandon, and her sister, Jessica, were being held, with no chance of making bail. Their case had been escalated to the federal level, which meant no easy way out, no quiet plea deals. The trial was pushed to the front of the line, set to start in just 3 months. And she, the survivor, would have to walk onto the stand and relive every moment of it. The agent then looked her in the eye and made a solemn vow. She would reclaim her life. I was told Stephanie just seemed vacant, unable to even imagine what part of her life was left to get back. But her lawyer, Eric, gently framed it as a chance to discover just that, to build something from the ground up, completely free from the suffocating influence of Brandon's deceptions. All she could do was nod, her hands clenched in her lap. The difference in their realities at that moment is something I still think about. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, and miles from there, in a cold, unforgiving building, Brandon and Jessica were being erased. Their clothes taken, their faces photographed, their futures reduced to a concrete box. The lives they had meticulously built were, for all intents and purposes, over. Stephanie Sullivan stood there in the wreckage, a person defined by sheer will and nerve. As the silence settled, she took a shaky breath, the raw sound of staying alive, and her voice was firm when she finally spoke. "Okay," she said, "let's finish this." 1 month later, the trial was a pressure cooker of human emotion. I saw her walk into that federal courtroom, her lawyer Eric on one side, a therapist on the other, an island of composure in a turbulent sea. Reporters, artists, and over 20 of the people Brandon Miller had financially ruined filled the benches, a silent jury of the betrayed. The real jury took their seats to her left, a mosaic of 12 ordinary people, 8 women and 4 men from their 20s to their 60s, suddenly tasked with defining the rest of Brandon's life. And across that tense room, I saw him at the defense table. He was swallowed by an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed at his waist. He looked less like a man on trial and more like a ghost at his own funeral. His face was a map of self-destruction, thin and unshaven, the confident structure of his features having collapsed into a hollow echo of the man who once shared her bed. His court-appointed lawyer, a man who seemed worn down by the case before it even started, shuffled papers next to him. At another table, her sister Jessica sat with her own attorney, a living monument to a betrayal that defied words. For 3 whole days of testimony, Jessica never once looked at her sister. Brandon's eyes were fixed on some distant, empty point, refusing to acknowledge the jury, the judge, or the lives he had shattered. That's when the federal prosecutor, Laura Reed, got to her feet. She was a woman who looked like she was forged in a furnace, maybe in her 50s, with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her resolve, and a voice that could cut glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "in a moment, you will watch an 18-minute video. In that recording," Reed went on, her voice steady as a rock, "you will see Brandon Miller confess. You will hear him admit, with his own mouth, to murdering his mother-in-law by poisoning her with ethylene glycol. You will hear him detail his plan to kill his wife by trapping her in a wine cellar and flooding it with carbon dioxide. And you will hear him brag about a 3-year affair with his wife's own sister." She paused, letting the reality of his actions fill the space. "Finally, you'll hear him make a toast to stealing $135 million. This case isn't a 'he said, she said.' This is a confession, clear, willingly given, recorded, and it is undeniable." At her signal, the lights went down and a large screen came to life. And there he was, Brandon, raising a glass of champagne. "To freedom," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "To $135 million. To us." The jury was absolutely still. Watching that recording was like being forced into the center of a nightmare. You saw Brandon, plain as day, admitting he'd poisoned a 1982 bottle of Margot. I saw one juror, a woman in her 40s, physically flinch, her hand shooting to her mouth. Later, when the video replayed Stephanie's tearful recorded confession and Brandon's cold reply, "That was 18 months ago," I saw a man on the jury just shaking his head, his jaw clenched in disgust. 18 minutes of the hell Stephanie endured, exposed for everyone to see. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Prosecutor Reed just stood there, letting the impact of his words sink in. In a last-ditch effort, Brandon's lawyer shot up from his chair. "Your Honor, I move to suppress this," he argued weakly. "My client had a reasonable expectation of privacy." But the judge was not having any of it. The motion was shot down with a sharp finality. Judge Thompson was not a man known for his patience. The FBI had a federal warrant, counselor, based on substantial cause. The recording stands. Continue. Brandon's lawyer collapsed back into his seat, completely out of moves. The next day, Stephanie was on the stand. The prosecutor walked her through the entire ordeal, every question a painful step back into that darkness. The faked phone call after her mother's funeral, the hidden cameras she installed, the poisoned wine, the cellar that was meant to be her tomb. Her voice cracked slightly when she described crawling through a dark service tunnel, hearing Brandon on the phone with a man, telling him to come and take care of the body. Her body. But she held herself together, her expression unyielding. She had sworn to herself he would not see her crumble. Once her testimony was done, Brandon's lawyer stood up. "Miss Sullivan," he began, his tone dripping with accusation. "Isn't it a fact that you set my client up? That you staged this whole thing to frame him?" "No," she replied, her voice suddenly like a shard of ice. "Your client was a predator long before I knew the truth. All I did was give him a stage to show the world who he really was." He kept pushing, trying to paint her as some kind of vengeful mastermind. "I survived," she shot back, her voice echoing with a power that captivated the room. "Your client tried to murder me. I escaped. The FBI built their case on the facts. Every signature Brandon forged, every cent he stole. That was him." His objections were dismissed one after another by the judge. When she finally stepped down, her lawyer, Eric, was waiting, gripping her hand with the look of someone who had just witnessed a lioness win her battle. The third day was a heartbreaking procession of the lives Brandon had destroyed. 22 women and 3 men, people in retirement, widows, families who had lost it all, testified one by one about how he had systematically dismantled their financial security. A woman from Portland named Sarah wept on the stand. "He took $400,000. It was my husband's life insurance," she cried. "I put all my faith in him." The jury's eyes all turned to Brandon, their faces hardening into masks of cold contempt. After all the victims had spoken, the closing arguments felt like a mere technicality. The defense had nothing left, and the prosecution had that unshakable video. The jury only needed 2 hours. Just 2. When they returned, the 4 women stood. On the charge of murder in the first degree concerning the death of Carol Sullivan, we find the defendant, Brandon Michael Miller, guilty. Brandon's head fell into his cuffed hands. On the charge of attempted murder of Stephanie Sullivan, guilty. On 18 counts of wire fraud, guilty. On 6 counts of identity theft, guilty. The verdicts came down one after another, a tidal wave of justice. 18 guilty counts for him. Then it was Jessica's turn. Guilty on 9 counts, including conspiracy. The sentencing was scheduled for 4 weeks later, on December 16th. By the day of the sentencing, the atmosphere had changed. The media circus was gone, and only the people whose lives had been permanently scarred remained. Judge Thompson read the sentence with a flat, administrative tone. "Brandon Michael Miller, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 60 years to be served concurrently. You are ordered to pay $18 million in restitution." And that's when Brandon's facade finally disintegrated. "This is insane! She framed me!" he screamed, trying to get up from his chair. 2 marshals were on him in a second, pushing him back down. The judge didn't even blink. "Jessica Connor, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with a chance for reduction after 20 years. You are ordered to pay $2 million in restitution. Model Ishi, standing there in his doorway, he'll look out over the valley one last time. I can almost hear him saying the words from his speech, a promise he made to himself and to every single person his foundation helps. A promise that you are not broken, that you have a right to your own story, and that you will reclaim your own damn name. Buddy lets out a sudden bark, and Brandon finally lets himself smile before he turns and goes inside. The house is so full of light these days, a sanctuary he's building for himself, one day at a time. The story of what was done to him, of what his wife Stephanie and her brother Eric plotted, is one that everyone needs to hear. The first major red flag was a phone call he overheard Eric on during Carol's funeral. The second was finding a bottle of poisoned wine they had planned for him to drink. And the third, the third was discovering the hidden panic room Carol had secretly built in the wine cellar, an escape route from a threat Brandon never even knew was there. His story is a chilling reminder that the most profound betrayals don't come from a stranger in an alley. The real monsters are often the ones who have a key to your front door. It's not always the person you don't know. Sometimes it's the brother-in-law who smiles right at you while he's planning your death. The lesson in all of this, the thing Brandon wants people to take away from his experience, is to trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. The whole fight to put Eric and Stephanie behind bars was never about getting even. It was about taking back everything they tried to destroy: his sense of safety, his sanity, and his future. The scars they left behind are just the proof that he survived. In all our sessions, Brandon never expressed regret for going after them in the way he did. His only true regret: not seeing the truth of who his wife, Stephanie, really was from day one. His story is a powerful reminder of the immense strength it takes to expose a deep evil, especially when it's woven into the fabric of your own family. And it's for anyone out there who feels their own struggle is too insignificant to matter. It never is. Brandon's journey is living proof that even when you've been dragged through the worst kind of nightmare, finding your way back to a place of peace is possible. Thank you for listening to his story. It's an important one. We've changed some identifying details for his privacy, but the core truth of his experience, that's a lesson that holds true for every single one of us.